Welcome back to the ASMR History Channel. My name is Sophie, and today we're delving into the intricate and turbulent world of the Italian Wars. This series of conflicts from the late 15th to the mid-16th century drew in the most powerful European states of the time, turning the Italian peninsula into a battleground of ambition and power. As we journey through these wars, we'll uncover the strategic alliances, the dramatic sieges, and the key figures who play pivotal roles in this era. So, settle into a comfortable spot, let the soothing sounds of history wash over you, and prepare for an enthralling narrative of ambition, rivalry, and Renaissance intrigue. Imagine the grand armies, the cunning diplomats, and the iconic cities of Italy caught in a web of conflict and culture. Whether you're here to unwind or immerse yourself in history, I promise a fascinating exploration of the Italian wars. Let's begin. In the medieval era, the Italian peninsula was a mosaic of territories, with the north divided into various fiefs and city-states under the nominal sovereignty of the Holy Roman Emperor. In the south, the kingdoms of Sicily and Naples, along with the Papal State, held sway. The 14th century witnessed the rise of major Italian powers like Milan, Venice, Florence, and the Papacy, expanding their territories by subduing smaller cities. Tensions resulting from these expansions endured into the following century, leading to the Lombard Wars between Milan and Venice. The Peace of Lodi in 1454 marked a period of stability among five influential regional powers: the Duchy of Milan, the Republic of Venice, the Papal State, the Kingdom of Naples, and the Republic of Florence. Under the guidance of Lorenzo de' Medici, the Italic League, a defensive alliance, was established to preserve peace. The following 4 decades saw a delicate balance of diplomacy and military posturing, with conflicts limited to localized skirmishes, while the Italian Renaissance thrived in cultural centres. However, this equilibrium was disrupted in the late 15th century after the passing of a Florentine statesman, sparking the First Italian War over the dynastic succession in the Duchy of Milan, as Gian Galeazzo Sforza assumed power in 1476, succeeding his father. At the young age of 7, Galeazzo Maria found himself thrust into the role of Duke of Milan. His uncle, Ludovico Sforza, took charge as regent, but instead of focusing on Galeazzo's education and governance of the duchy, he allowed the young duke to indulge in a life of luxury and entertainment. In 1489, Galeazzo married Isabel of Aragon, granddaughter of King Ferrante of Naples. Despite Ludovico's iron grip on power, Isabel sought help from her family to remove him from authority. Fearing interference from Naples and opposition from Florence, Ludovico sought support from King Charles VIII of France to strengthen his position and secure his rule. The Kingdom of Naples had a complex history dating back to the Norman conquests and had been embroiled in conflicts between various European powers for centuries. The French kings had inherited claims to the Neapolitan throne, leading to intermittent clashes with the Aragonese dynasty. By the late 15th century, France had consolidated power internally and was looking to expand its influence abroad. This ambition led King Charles VIII to set his sights on Italy, a region of strategic importance and rich cultural heritage. With meticulous planning and a formidable army at his disposal, Charles VIII embarked on a campaign to conquer Naples and establish a foothold in the Italian peninsula. Charles VIII's expedition into Italy marked a significant turning point in European politics and military strategy. With a well-equipped army and ambitious goals, the French king aimed to not only secure Naples, but also lay the groundwork for for a crusade against the Ottoman Turks. The campaign was a bold move that showcased France's growing power and ambition on the international stage. By venturing into Italy, Charles VIII was not only seeking territorial expansion, but also aiming to establish France as a dominant force in European affairs. The success or failure of this endeavour would have far-reaching consequences for the balance of power in the region and beyond. The highly publicised expedition led by Charles had a clear objective: to penetrate the territories of the young Duke of Savoy. The warm welcome extended by the Duke's mother to the king and his sizable army set a positive tone for the mission. The expedition made its way to Asti, an exclave of Orleans, on September 9th. Louis of Orleans, leading another army, took a different route by sea to Genoa, then under the governance of Milanese officials. As French groups secured strategic positions in Italy, Ludovico Sforza initiated the recruitment of soldiers for the impending mission. Actively countering the French preparations, the King of Naples, Alfonso II, forged an alliance with Pope Alexander VI. He strategically hindered the French progress by engaging mercenaries from Lombardy and Lazio. Alfonso II also dispatched his son Ferdinando, the Duke of Calabria, and the mercenary Gian Giacomo Trivulzio to Romagna, with the objective of invading Lombardy. Simultaneously, his brother Federico, accompanied by 4,000 men and exiled Genoese nobles, incited a rebellion in Liguria against the Milanese and French garrisons, aiming to disrupt their stronghold in Genoa. The conflict escalated with a failed assault on Porto Venere in July, followed by the occupation of Rapallo on September 5th. However, Louis of Orleans, supported by Swiss mercenaries and Genoese Milanese militias, decisively defeated the forces, thwarting any hopes of Neapolitan uprisings in the region. Skirmishes ensued between French and Milanese troops against the combined Neapolitan, Florentine, and Papal forces in Emilia, culminating in the sack of Mordano. The calculated strategy of the French monarch, characterised by the deliberate destruction of surrendered towns and the brutal treatment of civilians and defenders, marked a departure from traditional Italian rules of warfare. Amidst the tumultuous events, the passing of Duke Gian Galeazzo Sforza on October 21st, under dubious circumstances, prompted his uncle Ludovico to depart from Charles and assert his claim as the Duke of Milan, endorsed by the Holy Roman Emperor. Following a period of recovery from illness, Charles charted a new course along the western coast of the peninsula through Tuscany, applying strategic pressure to advance the French campaign. The people of Florence found themselves under the rule of Charles after Piero de' Medici's alliance with Alfonso put him in a vulnerable position. The citizens of Florence, sympathetic towards the French, posed a challenge to Charles as he navigated the situation with strategic manoeuvres. His attention turned towards the stronghold of Sarzanello and the city of Sarzana, eventually focusing on the Florentine exclave of Fivizzano, utilising cannons and enlisting the help of local noble Malaspina. Charles successfully captured and razed the town, leading to Piero de' Medici capitulating fortresses and cities to the French king. This surrender resulted in Piero's expulsion and the rise of a republican government in Florence, influenced by the teachings of Savonarola. As Charles continued his military campaign, he entered Pisa and Florence as a liberator from Florentine rule. Negotiations with the new government allowed Charles to maintain control of Tuscan cities temporarily, with financial support from Florence. The French army's advance caused upheaval in Rome, prompting rival cardinals to align with the French in a bid to reform the church and oust the corrupt defensive line facilitated the French progress into Umbria and Abruzzo, as nobles and condottieri switched allegiances to support the French cause. The French invasion stirred unrest in Rome, leading to the Colonna family seizing Ostia and undermining the city's defences. Charles eventually entered Rome and negotiated with the Pope for passage through the Papal State, falling short of his initial goal of securing the kingdom's coronation. Subsequently, Charles set his sights on Naples, anticipating tougher resistance than he had faced thus far. Naples was thrown into disarray when Alfonso II relinquished his throne to his son and departed for Sicily, absconding with the royal treasury. This sudden power shift prompted the Neapolitan barons, who had traditionally supported the Angevin dynasty, to align themselves with the French forces that were advancing into the region. The French were welcomed by the local population as liberators, but any pockets of resistance faced brutal suppression, such as the violent destruction of the stronghold at Monte San Giovanni. Despite efforts by Ferdinando to establish strongholds in San Germano and later Capua with his dwindling army, internal betrayals and revolts led to the fragmentation of his forces. Outmaneuvered and abandoned by his allies, Ferdinando was forced to flee with his court to Ischia, paving the way for Charles to enter Naples with minimal resistance on February the 22nd, 1495. The rapid and overwhelming conquest of the Italian peninsula by the French monarchy in just 5 months sent shockwaves throughout the region, leaving a profound impact on the Italian states. Ludovico il Moro, taken by surprise by the French military campaign, faced mounting challenges to his authority from Louis of Orleans. In response, the League of Venice was formed in the spring of 1495, uniting Spain, Milan, Venice, the Emperor, the Pope, and other minor Italian states in an effort to counterbalance French dominance. Despite the absence of contributions from Maximilian von Habsburg and Alexander VI, the League sought to challenge the French presence in Italy. As Charles decided to return to France, leaving a portion of his forces to defend Naples, his journey back was marked by maintaining control over Tuscan fortresses, causing tension with the Florentines. Meanwhile, Louis of Orleans faced resistance in Novara and Vigevano, ultimately becoming besieged by a Milanese army. Charles' march through Italy brought him into a confrontation with the League of Venice at Fornovo, where the Italian coalition, led by the Marquis of Mantova, Gianfrancesco, confronted the French forces in a significant battle. Conflicting reports abound regarding the exact troop numbers present at the Second Gonzaga conflict. Estimates suggest the army consisted of approximately 8,600 heavy knights, 1,500 Italian light cavalry and mounted crossbowmen, 800 stratioti from the Balkans, 8,000 infantry with various armaments, and a small artillery unit, totaling around 20,000 soldiers. Notable nobles from Romagna, including leaders from Bologna, Rimini, Ferrara, and Urbino, were also involved. On the other side, Charles's forces at Fornovo were said to include 5,500 mounted soldiers, a mix of heavily armoured knights, light cavalry, and mounted crossbowmen, with 400 hailing from Italy, 4,000 infantry, with 3,000 Swiss mercenaries taking the lead, and 42 cannons operated by 1,000 men, totaling just over 10,000 troops. As the two armies approached Fornovo, skirmishes broke out between their vanguards, with the Italian light cavalry managing to capture some of the enemy, while the French established a fortified camp on higher ground. The days that followed saw persistent harassment of the French camp by the Stradioti as the full armies closed in on the area. Charles, on July 6th, sent an emissary to negotiate a safe passage back to France. Internal disagreements among the Italians, with Venetian representatives hesitant to engage directly, and disputes within the League, complicating command, led to Charles bravely crossing the river and dividing his forces into 3 battalions along the northern bank, with the vanguard led by Gian Giacomo Trivulzio and the Marshal of Guy, making up the bulk of the troops, the artillery, and the Swiss mercenaries, ready for a challenging encounter. In response to the French army's advancement, Francesco Gonzaga decided to launch an attack by organising his troops into 3 columns, with half of the cavalry at the front, the other half in reserve, and a significant force protecting the fortified camp. Gonzaga's strategy involved coordinated assaults on the 3 groups simultaneously, aided by 2 squadrons of stradioti and mounted crossbowmen tasked with flanking and harassing the French left wing. The battle began with an artillery exchange that favoured the French but caused minimal casualties, following a night of heavy rain which caused the Taro River to swell unexpectedly, creating a significant obstacle. Gonzaga's central force faced delays in crossing the river after the left flank, slowing their progress towards the centre. Meanwhile, the Milanese knights on the right wing, led by the Count of Caiazzo, launched an attack on the vanguard, but quickly retreated after a failed attempt against the Swiss formation. At the camp, the stradioti assigned to harass the flank initially turned their attention to looting the baggage train, a chaotic scene filled with soldiers drowning or refusing to cross the river. Despite these challenges, the left and centre managed to navigate the river successfully and regrouped to launch an attack on the French rearguard. However, the rugged terrain proved unsuitable for a cavalry charge, leading the Italians to resort to a wave assault strategy that ultimately backfired. The encounter with the French line turned disastrous, as many soldiers abandoned the main assault for looting, leaving the Italians at a numerical disadvantage. The king narrowly escaped capture thanks to the Count of Vendôme's heroic sacrifice, but numerous Italian commanders lost their lives or sustained severe injuries during the intense battle. On the right flank of the Italian army, the infantry suffered heavy casualties at the hands of the Swiss forces, and the reserve's attempts to target the artillery faced staunch resistance. Overwhelmed by the situation, Gonzaga made the tough call to retreat, resulting in further losses as they crossed the river. Charles, after securing a path back to France, opted not to pursue the retreating enemy. While the French army did incur losses and lost their baggage train, the Italians bore a higher casualty toll, especially among their leadership. The significant number of Italian fatalities was attributed to the brutal French practice of targeting and killing the wounded rather than taking them as prisoners. Despite both sides claiming victory, it was evident that the Italians suffered heavier losses and failed to impede Charles, while the French managed to retain the field despite the setback of losing their baggage train. The prevailing perspective among modern historians leans toward attributing the victory to the French forces. Charles proceeded to Asti, with the League army following suit, later diverting to Navarra to avoid further conflict. There, Charles awaited reinforcements in Piedmont and regrouped with the unsuccessful Ligurian expedition. The Peace of Vercelli, a peace agreement brokered between France and Milan, saw Ludovico betraying his Venetian allies to grant Charles rights to utilise Genoa as a supply hub for Naples' defence, before Charles eventually returned to France. In the southern territories, Charles faced challenging circumstances as he left the Kingdom of Naples to confront the Holy League at Fornovo. Despite initially being welcomed in Naples, his stay was marred by the victors' haughty behaviour, leading to a sense of alienation among the locals. The tumultuous events surrounding the battle at Fornovo underscored the complex web of alliances, betrayals, and military strategies that defined this pivotal moment in European history. The citizens of Naples, frustrated by the rule of their king, staged a rebellion that led to a decisive victory over a joint Neapolitan and Aragonese military force at Seminara in June of 1495. This uprising coincided with the triumphant return of the former king, Ferdinand, who was able to take advantage of the popular revolt to lay siege to the fortresses where the French viceroy and nobles had sought refuge. As the situation escalated, Campania also joined the revolt, and the Venetians seized crucial positions, adding further complexity to the conflict. Despite facing initial setbacks, the French forces found themselves struggling against the Spanish army in Calabria and facing incursions by the Venetians in Puglia. The Viceroy of Naples eventually agreed to surrender the fortresses if no reinforcements arrived within a month, a decision that was followed by the harsh winter months that weakened the French position. Despite their attempts to break the siege, the French forces were unsuccessful, dealing with defections and shortages of supplies. The culmination of these challenges came when they were encircled at Atella in July 1496, leading to their surrender. Following his victory, King Ferdinand passed away, passing the throne to his uncle, Federico, who succeeded in restoring order by securing French territories in Gaeta and Taranto and gaining the support of the Pope. In the midst of these events, the Pisan revolt in Tuscany added another layer of complexity to the political landscape of Italy. Pisa's rebellion against French control resulted in the establishment of a republic, complicating Charles VIII's plans to use the city as a base for his campaign in Naples. The Florentines, eager to see Pisa return to their sphere of influence, faced challenges in persuading Charles to loosen his grip on the city. Amid these tensions, the power dynamics in southern Italy underwent a significant transformation, ultimately leading to the stabilization of the region under Federico's leadership. After the clash at Fornovo, the monarch made the difficult decision to give up his territories in Tuscany due to the mounting challenges of defending them. Livorno was handed over to Florence, but the garrison commander in Pisa chose to sell the fortress to the Pisans, sparking a competition between Venice and Milan to win over Pisa's allegiance. Various municipalities also lent their support to Pisa in resisting Florence's persistent attacks. Despite Pisa's determination to reclaim its lands, internal conflicts within the city complicated their efforts. In a strategic move to strengthen his position in Tuscany, Ludovico invited the Emperor-elect Maximilian von Habsburg to visit Italy. Maximilian, whose dynasty held vast territories in southern Germany and connections to the Kingdom of Hungary, saw his 1496 expedition to Italy as a chance to assert his influence in the region and secure the imperial throne. However, his unsuccessful siege of Livorno forced him to retreat to Austria empty-handed, failing to make any gains. Disillusioned by the unsuccessful campaign, Ludovico withdrew his forces from Pisa, allowing Venice to step in as the city's de facto protectors. The rivalry between Florence and Venice persisted, leading to continued military conflicts in and around Pisa. Ludovico attempted to weaken Venice by allying with the Florentines and instigating the Ottomans to attack the Venetians. In the early months of 1499, Venice brokered a truce with Florence, receiving a significant sum in exchange for relinquishing their control over Pisa. However, the Pisans remained steadfast in their resistance and successfully defended against another siege later that year. French and Swiss mercenaries made an attempt to breach Pisa's defences in 1500, managing to penetrate the city walls with their artillery, but were ultimately repelled by the resilient defenders. Within the city, in addition to the earthy fortifications erected by the Pisans, the mercenaries stationed there had abandoned their posts due to the tumultuous political landscape. Charles had meticulously gathered a formidable army with grand plans of reclaiming lost territories, but his sudden passing in April 1498 dashed all hopes of his ambitions coming to fruition. In his place, his cousin Louis the Poith ascended the throne with a burning desire to make a mark in Italy once again, but he first needed to ensure a solid line of succession. To achieve this, he decided to annul his marriage to Jeanne of France, who had not borne him any children in over 2 decades, and instead marry the widowed Queen Anne of Brittany to strengthen France's position in the region. In a strategic move to obtain papal approval for his actions, Louis offered Cesare Borgia, the son of the Pope, enticing titles and alliances to secure the support of the powerful Borgia family for his Italian endeavours. Despite his claims to the Duchy of Milan, internal political challenges in France posed significant hurdles to his inheritance. Buoyed by the military might of France, Louis embarked on a determined path to claim what he believed was rightfully his in Italy. The diplomatic missteps of Ludovico had alienated important allies like Venice, prompting Louis to broker a deal with the Venetian Republic. In exchange for financing his army and aiding in the siege of Milan, Louis promised the Venetians territorial gains and assistance against common enemies like the Turks. Meanwhile, Ludovico, facing a bleak outlook, struggled to rally support as his allies faltered and his efforts to bribe the French king bore no fruit. Amidst delays in fortification repairs and troop recruitment, Ludovico found himself increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The tensions escalated in July, culminating in the eruption of the Second Italian War in mid-August 1499. A substantial French army under the leadership of Ligny, D'Aubigny, and Trivulzio launched a relentless assault, swiftly conquering key strongholds and employing ruthless tactics reminiscent of previous conflicts. Cities like Volterra and Tortona swiftly surrendered to the advancing French forces, while Milanese defenders faced brutal reprisals. Ludovico, realising the futility of defending Milan, made a hasty retreat in September, leaving the city at the mercy of the invaders. By October, Louis had firmly established his control over Milan, instituting a new governing structure and leaving behind a French-style provincial administration to manage affairs. The swift and decisive campaign marked a turning point in the power dynamics of the region, solidifying France's presence in Italy and reshaping the political landscape. The regional administration of Lombardy was placed in the hands of the nobility, with Trivulzio being appointed as the overseer by the authorities. The people of Milan, tired of the French troops' presence and the heavy tax burdens imposed on them, erupted in riots during the tumultuous month of November. Responding to the widespread discontent, Ludovico Sforza led an army of 13,000 mercenaries from various regions such as Italy, Switzerland, and Germany down from the Alps in January 1500. Despite facing initial challenges, Sforza's forces managed to seize control of Como and Milan, forcing the French troops to retreat towards Novara and Alessandria. However, Sforza's indecisiveness and failure to fully leverage his numerical superiority allowed the French forces to regroup effectively. The siege at Novara ultimately reached a stalemate, with the Burgundians and Swiss aiding in the safe passage of the French soldiers. Sforza's ill-fated attempt to escape amidst the Swiss contingent led to his capture and eventual demise while in French custody. With the French forces back in control of Lombardy, they solidified their dominance through an increased military presence, imposing fines on rebellious towns and demanding reparations from Italian regions that had supported Ludovico. Simultaneously, Cesare Borgia, with the backing of his father Pope Alexander VI and the support of King Louis, began to carve out a territorial domain in central Italy. He set his sights on Imola and Forli, ruled by Caterina Sforza, successfully capturing both cities with minimal opposition. Cesare continued his conquest by taking over Pesaro and Rimini, eventually claiming the title of Duke of Romagna after subduing Faenza. Louis, wary of Cesare's growing power, decided to halt further actions against Bologna and Florence, allowing Castel Bolognese to fall under Borgian control. With Lombardy under his command, Louis shifted his attention towards Naples, where he faced stiff resistance from the ruling Aragonese monarch. Upon the successful conclusion of the Reconquista with the capture of Granada, Ferdinand found himself at the helm of a vast and unified realm, resulting from the amalgamation of Castile and Aragon. Building on the Aragonese interest in Italy, Ferdinand sought to extend his dominion by contemplating the acquisition of the Neapolitan throne held by the Italian branch of his Trastamara dynasty. This ambition materialized in the Treaty of Granada in the autumn of 1500, where an agreement was reached between Louis and Ferdinand to divide the kingdom. Louis was to ascend as king, overseeing Campania and Abruzzi, while Ferdinand was designated as duke, governing Calabria and Apulia. The papacy sanctioned these arrangements to accommodate the territorial ambitions of Cesare Borgia. Unbeknownst to King Federico, who was preparing for a potential invasion by the French and even sought aid from the Ottomans, the Treaty of Granada had already sealed his fate. Facing a rebellion from his barons, Federico valiantly defended Capua with a meagre force of 9,000 soldiers, only to be overwhelmed by the combined might of the French and Spanish armies. The French swiftly invaded Naples, forcing its surrender and demanding a hefty ransom to prevent looting. Left with no choice, a financially drained Federico accepted a pension in France along with the County of Maine, relinquishing his claims to the Neapolitan throne. Meanwhile, the Spanish forces, though slower in their conquest, laid siege to Taranto before eventually subjugating Naples. Cesare Borgia, in the wake of these victories, expanded his control over additional territories, encountering resistance from Italian mercenary leaders. Despite initially offering amnesty, Borgia eventually resorted to a ruthless slaughter of the dissenting mercenaries, sparking a coalition of rival Italian families to unite against him. Undeterred, Borgia marched towards Lazio, ready to confront his adversaries and solidify his grip on the region. The War of Naples in 1502 ignited a fierce conflict between France and Aragon, centred on disputed territories such as Città di Castello and Perugia. The Treaty of Granada's oversight of regions like Basilicata and Capitanata led to both powers laying claim to them, triggering the Third Italian War. Despite facing a 2-1 disadvantage, de Cordoba strategically retreated to Barletta, leveraging the Iberians' naval strength by awaiting reinforcement. In contrast, the French forces, commanded by the Duke of Nemours, attempted to draw de Cordoba into a decisive battle, only to find him fortifying his positions within the region's towns and forts. The ongoing confrontations between the two armies were marked by intense skirmishes and raids, including legendary nightly duels that reached their peak in the famous Disfida di Barletta, where Italian Italian knights emerged victorious over their French adversaries. The Spanish fleet's victories against the French off the Brindisi coast allowed de Cordoba to break the blockade of the Spanish base, leading to a successful raid on the primary French base at Rouvaux, and the capture of a significant number of enemy soldiers and horses. By April, the arrival of 2,000 Landsknecht soldiers bolstered de Cordoba's forces, matching the strength of Nemours' army. The decisive Spanish triumph near Seminara, where they overpowered the Swiss pikes, set the stage for the pivotal Battle of Cerignola. Commanded by Prospero Colonna, the Spanish forces, supported by German mercenaries and agile infantry, established a formidable position. Despite facing harassment from the French garrison in Cerignola, the two armies ultimately clashed on the outskirts of the town after a challenging march through the Apulian countryside. As de Cordoba led his army out of Barletta, pursued by Nemours, the culmination of their rivalry occurred at Cerignola, where the Spanish infantry's superiority became evident in a decisive engagement. The skillful positioning and tactics of the Spanish forces enabled them to outmatch and overcome the French troops, securing a significant victory in the ongoing conflict. Positioned on the left flank under the leadership of Colonna were a formidable group of men at arms, complemented by around 2,000 arquebusiers and a substantial arsenal of 20 cannons. On the opposite side, the right flank was staunchly guarded by 800 light horsemen under the command of de Cordoba, who also oversaw a reserve force of 400 additional men at arms. As the armies converged at Cerignola, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the French contingent, comprising 850 men at arms, 1,100 light horses, 3,000 Swiss pikemen, and 4,000 French and Italian infantry, faced a critical juncture. Despite enduring a grueling march without access to water, Nemours and his officers were urged to initiate an immediate assault. A fortuitous incident occurred just before the commencement of battle, as a spark inadvertently set off the Spanish gunpowder supply, rendering their cannons useless. However, de Cordoba interpreted this event as a positive sign foretelling their impending victory. Taking the lead under the command of the valiant Duke of Nemours, a courageous band of 250 French men at arms charged headlong towards the heart of the Spanish forces. Tragically, they were met with a devastating barrage of arquebus fire, becoming ensnared between deadly pikes and an unforeseen ditch. The chaotic onslaught of gunfire sowed confusion within the French ranks, resulting in the fall of numerous leaders, including the esteemed Duke himself. In response to the French infantry's advance, the Spanish cavalry swiftly executed a flanking manoeuvre, compelling de Cordoba to mobilise reserves for a decisive counterattack. The foot soldiers valiantly crossed the ditch, plunging into a brutal melee. In a matter of mere minutes, the Spanish emerged victorious with minimal losses, while the French contingent suffered significant casualties, with their supply train and artillery falling into enemy hands. The repercussions of the fateful engagement at Cerignola reverberated across the kingdom, as a vast majority of territories rallied in support of the Spanish cause, paving the way for their triumphant entry into Naples in May. The surviving French forces retreated to Gaeta, where they found themselves besieged by de Cordoba's relentless forces. Nevertheless, reinforcements led by the Marquis of Saluzzo compelled the Spanish to lift the siege. Concurrently, French troops, bolstered by allies from France and Lombardy, mobilised, presenting a formidable challenge to the Spanish borders. The passing of Pope Alexander in August 1503 resulted in the ascension of Pius III, an anti-French pontiff, further complicating the geopolitical landscape for the French leadership. The Battle of Cerignola stood as a watershed moment in military history, showcasing the tactical significance of mass arquebus deployment in warfare. Despite facing initial setbacks, the French demonstrated unwavering resolve in their quest to reclaim dominion over Naples, triggering a sequence of subsequent military stratagems and diplomatic negotiations in the region. The Pyrenees mountain range, once considered impenetrable, proved to be a significant obstacle due to unpaid troops and well-fortified defences. This situation led to a ceasefire being agreed upon in the region, allowing for a temporary respite in the conflict. Meanwhile, amidst the turmoil in Rome, de Cordoba skillfully established a defensive line while strategically withdrawing to buy time for his forces. As October drew to a close, the French troops advanced to Trieto, where they established their camp on the right bank of the Garigliano River. In response, de Cordoba was forced to retreat to the opposite bank to prevent being encircled by the advancing French forces. The French army boasted a formidable composition, with over 8,000 infantry troops hailing from various regions, supported by 1,500 heavy cavalry and 3,400 light cavalry units. In contrast, the Spanish forces fielded 1,000 infantry soldiers, including 2,000 Germans, 300 men at arms, and 500 light cavalry. Both sides were equipped with artillery, with a slight advantage leaning towards the French forces. The Spanish troops swiftly initiated the construction of defensive structures and trenches at key points along the river to impede the French attempts to cross. On November 5th, the French army successfully erected a pontoon bridge under the cover of their artillery, which effectively subdued the Spanish artillery and small arms fire. Despite Spanish efforts to thwart the bridge building by employing explosive rafts, a determined French detachment managed to cross the river, overpowering the Spanish garrison and securing their foothold on the opposite bank. The following day witnessed a fierce battle as Spanish and Italian cavalry launched a counter-offensive, only to be repelled by the well-positioned French forces, aided by transalpine cannons on rafts. Although the French achieved tactical victories, their progress was hindered by exhaustion and inclement weather conditions, prompting them to consolidate their positions and await more favourable circumstances in the spring. The challenging marshy terrain and relentless rains took a toll on both armies, resulting in widespread sickness among the troops. Tensions arose within the French ranks, particularly between the Italian and Transalpine soldiers, leading to desertions, including that of Gonzaga. As the harsh conditions persisted, the French forces were compelled to relocate to higher ground, while the Spanish received reinforcements that bolstered their cavalry strength. A daring plan proposed by Condottiero d'Alviano to construct a new boat bridge behind enemy lines gained traction, with construction commencing on December 28th, 4 miles north of the existing French bridge. Enshrouded in a thick veil of mist, the strategic manoeuvre of the Spanish troops in the early hours of the morning remained undetected by the French sentries stationed at the bridge. Led by the seasoned de Cordoba, the Spanish infantry, accompanied by German mercenaries and light cavalry, stealthily crossed the bridge, positioning themselves for a surprise attack. As the day unfolded, the Spanish forces swiftly seized the fortresses of Suyo and Castelforte, outmanoeuvring the French Marquis of Saluzzo's attempts to rally a defence. The disarrayed French forces proved no match for the organised and relentless march of the Iberian troops, resulting in a decisive victory for the Spanish. The aftermath of the battle saw the French forces in disarray, their abandoned camps a testament to the swift and efficient Spanish pursuit. The fleeing French army suffered significant casualties as they were relentlessly pursued by the victorious Spanish troops. The heavy losses incurred by the French, including a substantial number of lances, light cavalry and infantry soldiers, marked a turning point in the conflict for the Kingdom of Naples. The surrender of the remaining French forces in Gaeta solidified Spanish dominance in the region, ushering in a new era of Spanish rule that would endure for centuries. Amidst the military campaigns in Naples, a power vacuum emerged in Rome following the death of Pope Alexander VI. The ascension of Giuliano della Rovere as Pope Julius II brought about a period of political intrigue and shifting alliances. With the capture of Cesare Borgia and the consolidation of power in the hands of Julius II, the political landscape of Italy underwent significant changes. Venice, once preoccupied with fending off Ottoman threats, capitalized on the downfall of the Borgia family to expand its territorial holdings and assert its influence in the region. Pope Julius II's ambitious plans to expel the French from Lombardy and assert papal authority faced resistance from Venice, which opted to take advantage of the weakened papal military and the defeat of the French at Carigliano. Julius II, known for his assertive leadership and political acumen, set the stage for a series of power struggles and realignments in Italian politics. His efforts to consolidate papal authority and challenge the influence of external powers laid the foundation for a new chapter in the history of Italy, marked by shifting alliances and rivalries among the city-states. Protesting against the annexations in Romagna, the determined leader dedicated 2 years to meticulously assembling a formidable army. By the year 1506, his meticulous planning bore fruit as he successfully seized control of strategic regions such as Perugia and Bologna, effectively putting a halt to Venetian expansion in the area. Engaging in intricate negotiations with the major powers of Europe, he skillfully orchestrated the Treaty of Blois in 1504 between Louis of France and Philip von Habsburg, solidifying their alliance and setting the stage for further actions against common foes. Despite facing setbacks like the defeat at Carigliano, the astute leader navigated through challenges, including dealing with discontent among Swiss mercenaries who had occupied Bellinzona after the Battle of Novara. By relinquishing Bellinzona to appease the Swiss and thwarting their attempts to seize more territory, he adeptly secured his position and safeguarded his interests in Lombardy. The period spanning from 1502 to 1508 witnessed Florence's relentless efforts to subdue the resilient city-state of Pisa. Utilizing a mix of French and Italian condottieri, Florence launched multiple campaigns to conquer Pisa, but the Maritime Republic's tenacity and alliances with regional powers thwarted their endeavours. The turning point came with the strategic manoeuvres of the League of Cambrai, which isolated Pisa and led to its eventual surrender in June 1509 after a prolonged blockade. Despite breaching the city walls and laying siege, Florence's victory was only achieved through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic finesse, ultimately allowing Pisa to retain its independence under favourable terms. In the complex political landscape of Spain, the passing of Isabella of Castile in 1504 reshaped the power dynamics, leaving Ferdinand as the sole governor of Castile. The ascension of Juana and her husband Philip Habsburg in 1506 brought a new chapter, which was short-lived due to Philip's unexpected death in September. Ferdinand's subsequent actions in Naples, including military restructuring and diplomatic overtures, set the stage for a pivotal meeting with Louis in Savona in June 1507. This meeting laid the groundwork for a coalition against Venice, driven by a shared carousel of reclaiming lost territories and countering Venetian influence. The formalisation of the League of Cambrai in December 1508 marked a significant milestone, with key European powers uniting to confront Venice and address broader geopolitical challenges, including the Ottoman threat. The League, comprising a diverse array of states and entities, aimed to dismantle Venice, accusing it of sowing discord in the Christian world and presenting a united front in the face of external threats. Initially, the Pope was absent from Florence, leading to Venice's attempts to dissuade the Papal State from joining the conflict by offering cities in Romagna. These efforts backfired, resulting in excommunication for Venice. The city considered forming an alliance with the Ottomans, but ultimately decided on a strategy of attrition. They anticipated the League falling apart due to conflicting interests and opted to engage their enemies one by one. The hostilities began between Venice and the League in April 1509, with the French vanguard under Charles d'Amboise seizing Treviglio before retreating after defeating a small opposing force. Simultaneously, Louis led a large army into Milan, while the Venetian forces, commanded by Niccolo Orsini and Bartolomeo d'Alviano, pursued a strategy of attrition. On May 9th, Louis gained control of Cassano and Rivolta, facing the Venetian army without launching any attacks. The French forces then moved towards Crema, prompting Orsini to relocate his camp to the castle of Bandino. When the French vanguard attacked the Venetian rearguard, the Venetian troops retreated behind a dry riverbed and successfully defended against enemy assaults despite the challenging terrain. D'Alviano, leading the rearguard, tried to get reinforcements but was only allowed to cover the retreat. Upon arriving at the battlefield, a segment of the infantry had already charged the cannons, resulting in a chaotic battle where the Venetians showed great courage but were eventually overwhelmed. With additional units from both sides joining the battle, D'Alviano saw an opportunity to strike at the centre where the king was positioned. However, his advance was blocked by reinforcements, marking a crucial moment in the battle. Orsini, hesitant to send more support to the Venetian infantry, mainly made up of peasant militia, watched as their forces were decimated or fled as the confrontation intensified. The scene was chaotic, with both sides fiercely battling, and the outcome hanging in the balance as the conflict raged on. After a grueling 3-hour battle, the French cavalry, having regrouped strategically, managed to encircle D'Alviano and his troops, forcing them to surrender. The Venetians suffered significant losses in their rearguard, with nearly a quarter of their infantry divisions and approximately 30 cannons falling into enemy hands. While the Venetians did not face total defeat, the impact on their morale was profound. Orsini saw a high desertion rate among his soldiers, losing a third of his troops as they retreated to Mestre. In contrast, Louis and his forces experienced minimal casualties and swiftly took control of key cities previously held by the Dukes of Milan, such as Cremona, Crema, Treviglio, Brescia, and Bergamo, all of which willingly submitted to French authority. As Louis awaited his allies at the Veneto border, he even managed to capture Peschiera upon their arrival. In the aftermath of the Agnadello battle, Duke of Ferrara Alfonso d'Este wasted no time in asserting control over the Polesine and Rovigo regions. Simultaneously, the papal forces under Gonzaga conquered Assola and Lonato. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, Venice swiftly instructed their officials in Romagna and Apulia to evacuate. As a result, when the papal and Spanish troops arrived in these areas, Venice surrendered without This surrender removed the Pope and Spain's justification for continuing the conflict, thereby easing pressure from the south. However, Venice soon had to redirect its focus to the north. In early June, the imperial army made its way into Italy, quickly seizing most of Friuli. Venetian garrisons were pulled out from other Veneto cities, prompting Verona, Vicenza, Padua, Feltre, and Belluno to surrender to the emperor in anticipation of being treated as free imperial cities. Treviso was the only city that resisted, enduring an imperial siege until unexpected aid arrived from the rural populace of Venice's territories. Disenchanted with the occupying forces and fearing the dominance of urban oligarchies, the rural population sided with the Republic, launching attacks on enemy detachments and providing vital intelligence on enemy movements. Venice's strategic manoeuvring during the conflict in northern Italy allowed them to regain control of Vicenza while facing resistance in Verona from the French forces. The Venetian fleet's defeat at Policella by Alfonso d'Este's artillery led to a significant setback, forcing Venice to reassess its ambitions in Ferrara. The Pope, Julius, who had already asserted his authority over various regions, was increasingly alarmed by the French presence in Lombardy and Louis's rumoured plans to replace him with Cardinal d'Amboise. The subsequent peace treaty, signed by the Pope and Venice in February 1510, lifted the excommunication, marking a shift in alliances and strategies in the region. The Venetian Republic enjoyed a brief respite after the successful siege of Padua, but military operations resumed in Veneto by May 1510. French and Ferraran forces made significant advances into the Polesine region, reclaiming Monsalese and other territories, despite Venetian resistance led by Giampaolo Baglioni. Internal discord within the League and conflicting interests hindered their progress. The French forces eventually retreated to Lombardy to counter the Pope's initiatives, while the imperial troops faced pressure to withdraw and eventually disintegrated, allowing the Venetians to reclaim lost territories. The Pope, having secured control over Romagna, turned his attention to expelling the French from Italy. Targeting Alfonso d'Este and his control over Ferrara, a papal fief, Julius initiated military actions during the summer, occupying Modena and weakening French influence in Milan and Genoa through diplomatic channels. Utilising Matthias Schinner as a mediator, the Pope pursued a multifaceted strategy to challenge French dominance in the region and solidify his authority. The decision was made by the Swiss Diet to dispatch their army in support against Alfonso d'Este, a move that saw them march through Lombardy with the aim of facing off against the French. The French army, however, closely pursued the Swiss as they descended the Alps, hindering their ability to gather necessary supplies and resulting in the Swiss being forced to retreat back to their mountainous homeland. In September, the 70-year-old Pope made the decision to relocate to Bologna, overseeing his military forces that had been strengthened by the addition of troops from Venice and Spain. Despite the French forces' attempts to seize Bologna, their efforts were ultimately unsuccessful. In retaliation during the winter, the Pope managed to capture Concordia and Mirandola, although his advance towards Ferrara was impeded by the presence of a French army. When peace negotiations hit a roadblock the following spring, Julius opted to yield Modena to an imperial representative in order to consolidate his position. The French army later recaptured Concordia, sparking unrest among factions in Bologna and prompting the Allied forces to retreat to Ravenna, where they suffered losses from enemy cavalry in pursuit. Internal conflicts within the leadership escalated to the point of the assassination of a papal commander. Subsequently, the pro-French Bentivoglio family was reinstated in Bologna, leading to the withdrawal of French forces back to Milan. The Pope's active involvement in military and political affairs deviated from the traditional role of European monarchs, who viewed the Pope as holding a superior spiritual authority. Rumblings of reformation within the Catholic Church grew among European monarchs, particularly after the French Church's declaration of autonomy from papal authority. King Louis orchestrated a council in Pisa with the aim of restructuring the Church and deposing the Pope. However, Julius managed to rally support and convene the Fifth Lateran Council, discrediting the efforts of the Pisan Council. In October 1511, Julius formed the Holy League with Venice, Spain, and England, securing an agreement with the Swiss Confederacy for the deployment of their mercenaries. The Swiss army, in December, advanced towards Milan in anticipation of a citywide uprising, but internal disagreements during negotiations fractured their ranks, leading to their retreat. The newly appointed governor of Milan, Gaston de Foix, Duke of Nemours, supported by additional French troops, confronted the Swiss incursion. The papal army, under the leadership of the viceroy Ramon de Cardona, in collaboration with the Spanish forces, initiated a siege on Bologna. In response, de Foix swiftly returned to Emilia to fortify the defences and effectively forced the Spanish troops to retreat. Following this successful defence, de Foix led his army to conquer the Venetians in Lombardy, resulting in a brutal sack of the region. The Duke then redirected his focus back to Emilia to confront the Spanish army, leading to the pivotal Battle of Ravenna. As the Easter Sunday dawned, the French army, comprised of a formidable combination of cavalry, infantry, and artillery, advanced towards the encampment held by the Spanish papal forces. The League had strategically fortified their position, utilising a trench and deploying their troops strategically. Both the French and Spanish forces readied their cavalry, infantry, and artillery in anticipation of the imminent clash. Upon reaching the Spanish defensive line, the French army paused, expecting the artillery barrage to weaken the enemy's defences. The Duke of Ferrara and Allegra strategically positioned their artillery to unleash a devastating barrage on the vulnerable Spanish positions. Amid the chaos of the crossfire, the Spanish infantry sought shelter on the ground, bracing themselves for the relentless assault. The Battle of Ravenna unravelled with intense exchanges of artillery fire and infantry skirmishes between the opposing forces. The outcome of the conflict heavily relied on the strategic placement and firepower of both the French and Spanish armies. This decisive clash at Ravenna not only determined the course of the Italian War, but also solidified the control over crucial territories in the region, marking a significant turning point in the power dynamics of the time. In the midst of the tumultuous battlefield, the heavy cavalry faced a precarious situation as they struggled to find adequate cover from enemy fire, resulting in significant losses. Fabrizio Colonna, the papal cavalry leader, was compelled to take matters into his own hands when his calls for an attack went unheeded, leading a daring charge against the enemy forces. Simultaneously, Navarro, the Spanish infantry commander, initially intended to sacrifice the cavalry to shield his infantry, only to find himself embroiled in a fierce confrontation with French and German infantry units. The Spanish men-at-arms, lacking the discipline of their French counterparts, were swiftly surrounded and subdued by the gendarmes, despite enduring heavy bombardment. Meanwhile, the French light cavalry executed a successful campaign against their Spanish counterparts, driving them from the field as the Ferrarese cannons continued to sow chaos among the ranks. Duke Alfonso d'Este, upon learning of the havoc caused by the cannons, urged the bombardiers to continue their assault without hesitation, emphasizing the enemy's presence. Despite valiant resistance from the Spanish infantry against the German Landsknecht forces and the Italian defence against the Gascons, they were eventually overwhelmed by a swift and decisive charge from the French cavalry, leading to the surrender of the League's second line, including the Spanish cavalry en route to support Colonna. Amidst the strategic retreat of the Spanish infantry, the Duke of Nemours made a fatal error by recklessly charging into their midst, resulting in his capture and demise. The combined Spanish-Papal forces suffered substantial losses, with key commanders taken captive, while the French, though facing fewer casualties, lost several important leaders. The aftermath of the Battle of Ravenna saw the city subjected to pillaging by Gascon and German soldiers, prompting the French army under Jacques de la Palice to retreat to Lombardy, with a smaller contingent staying behind to safeguard Romagna. The loss of their young commander led to a temporary loss of momentum for the French forces, enabling the League to mount a counter-offensive fueled by the Pope's impassioned call to drive out the invaders. The Swiss mercenary army, renowned for its prowess and discipline, embarked on a campaign into Lombardy that saw them met with little resistance. Bolstered by the support of Venetian troops, they swiftly made their way through the region, with Papal forces securing Emilia and Romagna. Despite an initial setback, when La Palice's attempt to confront the invading army in Veneto failed due to a lack of infantry and funds, the Swiss forces managed to successfully oust La Palice after a brief siege in Pavia. This marked a significant victory, liberating most of Lombardy and Liguria from French rule. The Swiss then secured a deal with Ludovico Sforza's son, Massimiliano, installing him on the throne in exchange for financial compensation and land, solidifying their influence in the region. Following the Swiss triumph, the Spanish army, under the leadership of Cardona, joined forces with Papal troops to launch an assault into Tuscany aimed at toppling Piero Soderini's pro-French administration in Florence. The brutal ransacking of Prato by the Spanish infantry resulted in a devastating loss of life, forcing Florence to surrender to Cardona. Subsequently, the city was handed over to Giuliano de' Medici, marking the restoration of the Medici dynasty's rule in Florence. As the alliances in the region continued to shift, the Papal State forged a new partnership with Maximilian Habsburg, causing tensions to rise with the Venetians. In response to the changing dynamics in the region, the Venetians, feeling aggrieved by the surrender of Brescia to the Spanish and the new alliance forming, realigned themselves with the French in a strategic move in March 1513. This realignment further divided northern Italy between the two dominant powers, prompting Talviano to return to Venice after being held captive in France. Meanwhile, the death of Pope Julius in February 1513 led to the election of Cardinal de' Medici as Leo III, who sought to strengthen his family's position in central Italy. This resulted in joint military actions by France and Venice against the Duchy of Milan in May 1513, further intensifying the power struggles in the region. Departing from Novara's gate under the cover of night, the Swiss infantry meticulously organised themselves into 3 columns before advancing towards the scattered French encampment, located a few kilometres east. The main force strategically positioned themselves at Cascina Ariotta, readying themselves for the impending confrontation. The French, caught off guard by the sudden assault, scrambled to assemble their troops for battle. The primary column of 7,000 Swiss soldiers boldly advanced towards the French right flank, where an equally matched group of land landsknechts stood guard with the artillery. Despite facing a relentless barrage of cannon fire, the Swiss soldiers, known for their unwavering bravery, fearlessly pushed forward in their tightly knit pike formations, resulting in significant losses as they engaged the German mercenaries in fierce combat. Simultaneously, the remaining Swiss forces swiftly dealt with the Italian and French foot soldiers, effectively thwarting the advances of the French light cavalry. Hindered by the challenging terrain, the heavy French cavalry found themselves struggling to mobilise for combat. The ensuing battle was nothing short of a brutal and bloody clash, culminating in the Swiss emerging victorious over the German mercenaries. They swiftly turned the captured French cannons against their former owners, ultimately routing the enemy forces as the French infantry retreated from the battlefield, leaving many fallen soldiers in their wake. Despite the Swiss suffering losses of approximately 1,500 soldiers, their triumph over a larger adversary, after enduring days of grueling marching, elevated their reputation to new heights. In the aftermath of the battle, the French forces retreated back to France, being pursued by both the Swiss and the Spanish, marking a significant turning point in the conflict. On another front in the east, the Venetian army, after retreating from Brescia, attempted an unsuccessful siege of Verona. Faced with staunch resistance from the garrison and the absence of French support in Italy, the Venetians found themselves compelled to once again adopt a defensive stance, concentrating their efforts around Padua and Treviso. In contrast, the combined Spanish and Imperial forces took aggressive measures to dislodge Dalviano from Padua, plundered Mestre, and provocatively launched artillery volleys towards Venice. Positioned strategically between the enemy's capital and their own forces, the Allied army made the strategic decision to withdraw in October, leading to a retaliatory pursuit by Dalviano, resulting in a resounding defeat near Vicenza at the hands of the well-disciplined Spanish and German infantry. The League consolidated their control over Vicenza, effectively concluding the campaign in Italy for that year. Furthermore, in August of the same year, the Swiss Confederacy and Imperial troops seized the opportunity to invade Burgundy, laying siege to Dijon and leveraging their recent victory at Novara to press their advantage. Faced with the looming threat of losing a significant portion of his heartland, Louis was compelled to initiate peace negotiations with the Swiss, ultimately relinquishing his claims in Lombardy to secure his eastern borders. The setback at Novara left Louis unable to provide reinforcements to his Italian allies, especially with the English, a long-standing adversary of the French crown, aligning themselves with the Holy League against him, further complicating the already intricate political landscape of the time. During the tumultuous period of the 100 Years' War, the Kingdom of England found itself embroiled in the internal conflict known as the War of the Roses, pitting the York and Lancaster factions against each other. This era of turmoil eventually came to an end with the rise of Henry VII of House Tudor, who sought to stabilise the nation's economy and consolidate his rule and borders. Following his reign, his son Henry VIII ascended to the throne in 1509, eager to leave his mark on history through involvement in continental politics. While initially participating in the League of Cambrai, Henry's ambitions for conquest in northern France were reignited when presented with an opportunity to join the conflict against France. In 1512, during the Battle of Ravenna, Henry made decisive military moves by dispatching his fleet to disrupt French and Breton coastal defences, launching an attack on the French fleet at Brest. Additionally, he sent 6,000 troops to aid Ferdinand of Aragon in the conquest of Navarra and the assault on Guyenne. Despite these efforts, Henry's desire for glory was not fully realised. To rectify this, in the summer of 1513, he organised a large-scale expedition led by himself. With the support of his council, Henry landed in Calais with a formidable army of 35,000 soldiers, including campaigners forming his invasion force. Before the main English army arrived, forward and rearward contingents pushed towards Marquise before turning eastward with the objective of capturing the French stronghold of Terouanne, crucial for safeguarding France's northern borders. Despite English calls for surrender, the defenders of Terouanne, inspired by the rallying cry "Vive le Roi," refused to yield. The ensuing siege was protracted, with the city walls proving resilient against English bombardment. The supply routes from Calais to the besieged city were vulnerable to French raids, resulting in significant losses during a convoy attack. Efforts to tunnel beneath the walls were met with vigorous countermining by the defenders, while German mercenaries impeded trench digging with their arquebuses. Departing Calais on July 21st, Henry, accompanied by his artillery train and German mercenaries, engaged in skirmishes with French garrisons en route to establish a camp near Terouanne by August 1st. Emperor Maximilian later reinforced Henry with around 1,500 men on August 10th. Meanwhile, Louis of France gathered troops at Blangy to relieve the siege. Henry responded by leading his forces across the Lys to reinforce the blockade from the south, setting up a camp at Guinegate to confront the advancing French troops. Despite the steadfast defence of the Terouanne garrison, the siege continued with both sides locked in a tense standoff. Struggling with depleting resources and facing the looming threat of a siege, the French cavalry meticulously planned an expedition to transport vital provisions and gunpowder to the besieged city. The operation, initiated on the 16th, involved a well-coordinated effort. One group of horsemen was strategically deployed to disrupt the advancing English forces from the northern front, while another contingent was entrusted with safely delivering the much-needed supplies, closely guarded by a third unit following a carefully mapped-out route that had been used previously to reinforce the city defences. However, Henry had been forewarned of the impending French attack and had adeptly positioned his light artillery atop a strategic vantage point on a small hill, with his archers strategically placed behind a protective hedge. As the French cavalry advanced towards Terouanne, located between Bommy and Guinegate, they were met with a sudden and fierce barrage of arrows and arquebus shots from the English forces, catching them off guard. The initial group, faced with unexpectedly strong resistance, faltered and then retreated in disarray, inadvertently colliding with their fellow comrades. With the looming threat of encirclement by the English cavalry as they regrouped, panic ensued, leading to a chaotic retreat as the French knights hastily fled the battlefield. Meanwhile, the diversionary unit, tasked with creating a distraction in the city's northern periphery, engaged in skirmishes with the English light cavalry. The garrison, making a valiant effort to confront the advancing English infantry, found themselves effectively contained. The reasons behind the swift retreat of the French forces, whether due to fear, strategic orders to avoid direct confrontation, or a combination of both, remain a point of debate among historians. The retreat quickly devolved into a rout which was skillfully exploited by the Burgundian cavalry, resulting in the capture of several notable figures, including the renowned knight Bayard, La Palisse, and the Duke of Longueville. Despite the losses, casualties were surprisingly minimal. Following the route and subsequent capture of the French cavalry, the besieged garrison made the difficult decision to surrender the city on the 23rd, recognising the grim reality of their diminishing supplies and the unlikely prospect of further reinforcements. With the city's capitulation, Henry and Maximilian opted to dismantle Terouanne's fortifications and raze the city to the ground, deeming it indefensible. They then set their sights on Tournai, which fell after a brief siege on September 23rd, effectively concluding the campaign. Tournai would remain under English control until 1518, marking a significant turning point in the ongoing conflicts between France and England. The Scottish invasion of England, culminating in the pivotal Battle of Flodden, unfolded against a backdrop of complex political alliances and historical animosities, exploiting the absence of the English monarch, who was preoccupied with the continental campaigns. The Scottish kingdom seized the opportunity to launch an audacious incursion into English territory. Despite efforts towards peace, exemplified by the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, ratified between Scottish King James Tudor IV and Henry VII of England in 1502, tensions remained high due to Scotland's enduring alliance with France. The Old Alliance, a long-standing pact between Scotland and France, further complicated matters for James, who found himself entangled in the conflict between his French allies and the English. The delicate balance between maintaining diplomatic relations with England while honouring the Old Alliance would ultimately lead to a fateful clash at Flodden, forever altering the dynamics of power and diplomacy in the region. In the historical events of May 1512, the strategic manoeuvring of Henry VIII led to the formation of a coalition between the Scots and the French. This alliance, initiated by Henry's departure for France, saw King James receiving support from the French Queen to launch an offensive in the Northern Territories. With a well-equipped army, King James authorised incursions into English borderlands, leading to a significant siege in August 1513. The Earl of Surrey, acting as the Lieutenant General of the Northern Army, faced a formidable Scottish force of around 25,000 soldiers. Despite James's honourable forewarning of the impending invasion a month earlier, the stage was set for a decisive confrontation. On September 9th, the Earl of Surrey issued a direct challenge to King James for a battle at Flodden, with the Scottish army well positioned on a hill. The Earl's strategic crossing of the river Tillet-Wooler, followed by a swift recrossing behind the Scottish army, disrupted their supply lines and caught them off guard. James then regrouped his forces at Branxton Hill, while the English troops gathered in the village below. The clash began with an intense exchange of artillery fire, where the English cannons proved superior despite the challenging terrain that dampened their impact. As the battle unfolded, the Scottish left flank launched a daring assault on the English right, initially gaining some ground before facing resistance. The Earl swiftly deployed his cavalry to bolster the defences and prevent a collapse. Despite the Highlanders' use of French pikes, they struggled with their effectiveness in combat. The left flank eventually retreated, and the central unit descended the hill, only to falter in the muddy conditions. The relentless English longbow fire and close combat inflicted heavy casualties on the Scottish forces. In a bold move, King James himself entered the fray, seeking to capture the Earl of Surrey, but found himself defeated in the ferocious melee that ensued. The command of the Scottish army was in a dire situation, with the Highlanders rushing to aid their king, James IV, as the English longbowmen advanced on the opposing side. The battle resulted in heavy losses for the Scottish forces, with approximately 10,000 troops falling compared to around 4,000 English casualties. The death of King James IV led to the sought to break free from diplomatic isolation by forming alliances with England and the Pope. By marrying King Henry's sister Mary, Louis solidified his ties with England, despite challenges in reconciling with the Pope over the Council of Pisa. Additionally, political considerations involving Florence's economic interests in France led to the marriage of Giuliano de' Medici and Filiberta of Savoy. The ongoing conflict in Veneto saw a series of invasions and counterattacks that resulted in a prolonged stalemate in the region. Following King Louis's death on January 1st, 1515, his cousin Francis ascended the French throne. Francis, a charismatic and skilled military leader, moved swiftly to assert French interests in Italy. He reaffirmed alliances with England and Venice, secured a truce with Charles Habsburg of the Low Countries, and anticipated the Pope's neutrality through a strategic marriage the previous year. With a new ruler at the helm, France was poised to continue its influence in the Italian peninsula, with a formidable force of 23,000 landsknechts, 11,000 horsemen, and 60 artillery pieces at his disposal. The French king was able to gather a substantial army. Sensing the concentration of troops in Lyon, the Swiss in Milan took preemptive action by dispatching soldiers to obstruct vital passes in the Alps before the French could advance. Despite these efforts, Francis, aided by Trivulzio's reconnaissance, managed to outmaneuver the Swiss by infiltrating Italy through rugged southern valleys. Upon reaching Saluzzo, La Police orchestrated a cunning ambush that caught the Milanese cavalry off guard. This victory left the Swiss without their mounted support, prompting them to retreat and regroup around Milan, while the Pope sent a minimal cavalry detachment to assist them, focusing his main forces on securing Parma and Piacenza. Undaunted, Francis continued his advance, capturing Novara and Pavia, and ultimately forcing the Swiss, along with Massimiliano, to seek terms for peace, leading to the signing of the Treaty of Gallarete. As the Battle of Marignano unfolded, Francis strategically positioned himself in the town of Melegnano to isolate the Swiss from the League's forces encamped near Piacenza and to draw closer to his Venetian allies stationed in Lodi. Divisions arose among Milan's leaders regarding whether to engage the French forces, with a clash near Porta Romana between papal and French cavalry stirring the Swiss to converge at the castle of Milan. Cardinal Scheiner's persuasive arguments convinced most commanders to confront the French army, leading them to advance confidently towards Porta Romana. The Swiss army, consisting of approximately 25,000 to 30,000 infantry and 10 cannons, received reinforcements from cavalry units from the Papal State and Spain, Sforza loyalists, and disorganised Milanese troops. On the opposing side, there was a mix of cavalry, landsknechts, French and Gascon foot soldiers and artillery. The Venetian contingent in Lodi brought heavy and light cavalry units along with infantry to the battle. Ahead of the conflict, the Swiss divided themselves into 3 battalions to strategise their approach. As the Swiss forces advanced with a meticulously planned strategy, their limited intelligence about the French's whereabouts led them to encounter the enemy north of Marignano. The resounding roar of cannons marked their approach, aiming to boost morale and signal their imminent arrival to the French, as confirmed by their spies. Upon reaching San Giuliano, the Swiss leaders realised the need to revise their tactics due to the inaccurate intelligence they had received. Despite challenges such as the late hour and the smoke and dust obstructing their view, their primary concern remained locating the French artillery, which they identified as the most significant threat. The Swiss initiated the assault with cannon fire, pinpointing the fortified position of the French behind a deep trench. Undaunted, the Freignechter soldiers courageously charged the cannons head-on, despite heavy casualties in the initial wave. Subsequent Swiss forces breached the defences, engaging in fierce combat with the German and Gascon defenders. They maintained their cohesion against enemy counterattacks, ultimately capturing 7 artillery pieces and forcing the vanguard and Milanese allies to retreat. King Francis observed the faltering vanguards and organised a cavalry charge to rally the Swiss pikemen who were pursuing Landsknechts. Simultaneously, Constable Bourbon orchestrated a counter-offensive on the right flank, using a battery on the second line to repel a Swiss battalion. The intense fighting continued into the night, with French troops struggling to distinguish between friend and foe. The skirmish finally ended at 11 p.m, leaving both Swiss and French forces nervously encamped at San Giuliano and Zivido. Facing logistical challenges, the French attempted to dislodge the Swiss from their positions, with some units mistakenly camping behind enemy lines and experiencing shortages of supplies. Trivulzio, with the help of engineers, sabotaged a nearby canal embankment, flooding the defensive ditch and disrupting Swiss positions, destroying a significant portion of their gunpowder. Meanwhile, King Francis, personally leading the charge throughout the night, sent a messenger to Lodi, summoning D'Alviano and his forces to join the impending battle. At daybreak, Francis strategically deployed his troops into 3 units, positioning himself at the centre with artillery support in the forefront, ready for the next phase of the conflict. As Bourbon and the Duke of Alençon strategically led their respective wings into the intense battle, the Swiss formations bravely advanced towards their adversaries. The largest group of Swiss soldiers specifically targeted the king's location, enduring a relentless barrage of crossbow bolts, arquebus shots, and cannon fire that caused some to momentarily retreat. Despite the fierce opposition, a courageous band of Swiss pikemen managed to brave the flooded trench, seize the enemy's artillery, and engage the centre of the opposition. Simultaneously, Bourbon launched a decisive attack on the Swiss Central Battalion on the French right flank. In a spectacular display of skill and valour, the Swiss unit on the left managed to rout Alençon's cavalry, while some soldiers diverted their attention to the king's central forces, with others bravely pursuing the fleeing enemy troops. Following a swift and strategic reorganisation of the left flank's cavalry, the Venetian vanguard, under the leadership of D'Alviano's skilled horsemen, entered the tumultuous battlefield. The reinvigorated French cavalry, together with D'Alviano's troops, launched a fierce assault on the Swiss left flank. However, their efforts proved futile, as they were swiftly repelled by the resolute Swiss defenders. Despite their initial success, the Swiss soldiers grew disheartened upon sighting the approaching Venetian forces, leading to the collapse of their right and left flanks, with soldiers dispersing in various directions. The central Swiss formation, realising defeat was inevitable, valiantly attempted a strategic retreat while facing heavy enemy fire. While some successfully escaped along the main road flanked by waterways, a group of 6,000 sought refuge in a nearby forest, putting up a gallant resistance until they were eventually dislodged by the relentless enemy cannons. Others who sought shelter in nearby structures faced a grim fate, either succumbing to flames or falling victim to brutal massacres. Trivulzio later immortalised the battle as the Battle of Giants, with Francis being knighted by the esteemed French warrior Bayard, earning him the esteemed reputation of a chivalrous king. The battle's toll was heavy, with over 10,000 Swiss soldiers perishing and thousands more sustaining injuries or being captured, while the French casualties numbered around 5,000. escalate tensions with the Swiss Confederacy, chose not to pursue them further. The French swiftly re-established control over Lombardy, with Milan capitulating shortly after. Massimiliano Sforza, who was perceived as a Swiss puppet, was treated with respect and escorted to Paris, where he lived out his days in comfort. On the 11th of October, Francis triumphantly entered Milan, which paid a substantial fine for its defiance, solidifying French dominance in the region. In the aftermath of the grueling battle, Swiss emissaries initiated peace talks that eventually led to an agreement resembling the Treaty of Galaret. However, some cantons were hesitant to accept the terms, reluctant to relinquish their territorial gains in Lombardy. Meanwhile, Cardona returned to Naples in preparation for potential hostilities, while Pope Leo indicated a willingness to engage in negotiations. Eventually, a pact was brokered, with Francis pledging protection to the Medici family, Florence, and the Papal State. Giuliano was appointed Duke of Nemours, with the Pope vowing to safeguard their interests, marking a significant turning point in the intricate web of European alliances and power dynamics. The return of Parma and Piacenza to the Milanese state was a significant development that was facilitated through a meeting in December 1515 in Bologna. During this meeting, various agreements were reached, including the Pope gaining autonomy over the French Church and confirming the integrity of the Duchy of Ferrara. However, by October of the following year, the French army faced challenges while aiding Venice in besieging Brescia. The siege was met with disruptions and the arrival of a German relief force in December, complicating the situation. In February 1516, a new threat emerged as English King Henry VIII financed a Swiss invasion, supported by Maximilian's troops, which entered Italy but was expected to encounter financial difficulties. This led to their departure, as there was no significant uprising in Milan. In November, Francis managed to secure a peace agreement with the Swiss Confederacy through the Treaty of Fribourg, which effectively liberated Milan from Swiss intervention. Meanwhile, Pope Leo pursued the establishment of a Medicean stronghold in central Italy by assigning Florence to Giuliano de' Medici. However, plans to install Lorenzo in Naples faced opposition from the French king. Despite Lorenzo gaining control of Florence, his attempts to annex Lucca and Siena were unsuccessful. His decision to launch an attack on Urbino in the summer of 1516 led to a conflict with Duke Francesco Maria della Rovere. Della Rovere fled his duchy as it was overrun, but he returned the following year with troops from Verona, sparking a costly war that eventually resulted in a compromise allowing him to retire in Mantua. Lorenzo's death in 1519 led to Caterina de' Medici becoming the heir, and resulted in direct papal governance of the duchy. In May 1516, Brescia surrendered to the Venetian Republic in the Po Valley after a series of skirmishes, leading to further advancements by the Venetian and French armies towards Verona. The city of Vicenza endured a tumultuous period characterized by frequent changes of control between the Battle of Agnadello and 1517, leading to immense suffering for its residents. Despite being a powerful Italian state, the Venetian Republic faced severe economic hardships following the conclusion of the war in Veneto in January 1517, when negotiations between the Habsburgs and Francis resulted in Vicenza being handed over to the Venetians. The region had been deeply scarred by the brutal clashes of various armies, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Moreover, the peninsula had become a crucial focal point for two major European powers as they vied for dominance, further complicating the situation in Vicenza and the surrounding areas. The unexpected ascension risks to the Spanish throne began with the marriage of Philip the Handsome, Duke of Burgundy, to Joanna of Castile in 1496. Despite not being the original successor, a series of deaths within Joanna's family propelled her to the position of heir presumptive to the Iberian monarchies by 1500. However, Joanna's mental instability led to her confinement in a castle for the remainder of her life following the deaths of her mother, Isabel of Castile, and her husband Philip. This left her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, as the regent of Castile until their grandson Charles reached adulthood. Charles, who had been under the guardianship of his Aunt Margaret in the Low Countries, assumed the thrones of Castile and Aragon at the age of 15 upon Ferdinand's passing in 1516. He quickly consolidated his authority over the kingdoms and, in August 1516, signed the Treaty of Noyon with Francis, which delineated the spheres of influence in Italy between the French and Spanish, resulting in the cession of Verona to the Venetians. The passing of Emperor Maximilian in January 1519 paved the way for a new leader to be elected by the 7 imperial electors, as the imperial crown was not hereditary but elective. The weary Archduke had depleted his resources in an effort to secure the election of his grandson, Charles, amidst competition from the ambitious French monarch, Francis, who aimed to solidify his control over Italy. Francis invested significant financial resources in influencing the imperial electors, who, seeking a Germanic emperor to counterbalance French power, ultimately accepted French support before choosing Charles as the emperor in June 1519. This election prompted Pope Leo to take strategic measures, especially as the reformist ideas of Martin Luther were gaining traction in Germany, underscoring Charles's pivotal role in preserving the unity of the Church. Leo, as the Pope, found himself entangled in the intricate web of alliances and conflicts that defined the political landscape of Europe during his reign. Faced with the looming threat of the youthful emperor, Leo made a strategic decision to form a partnership with Charles, a move that carried significant implications for the balance of power in the region. By aligning with Charles, Leo aimed to combat heresy in Germany and secure territorial gains for the Papal States in the form of Parma and Piacenza. In exchange for these concessions, the Pope agreed to provide financial support for military campaigns aimed at driving the French forces out of Lombardy. The pact between Leo and Charles, sealed in May 1521, set the stage for a series of military hostilities that would play out across Italy and beyond, as Francis threw his support behind the King of Navarre in a bid to challenge Spanish rule in Spain. Tensions escalated, leading to skirmishes and retaliatory strikes between the opposing factions. Meanwhile, conflicts in Luxembourg and the northern regions of France further strained relations between Charles and Francis, prompting both sides to mobilise their troops along the Flanders border in anticipation of further confrontations. The Italian campaign that followed saw a series of engagements and sieges as commanders like Odette de Foix and Prospero Colonna led their forces, supported by Swiss mercenaries who played a key role on both sides of the conflict. The Spanish papal armies crossing of the Po River to join forces with their Swiss allies marked a significant turning point in the unfolding military operations. As the power dynamics continued to shift and evolve, the complexities of the alliances and conflicts at play only grew more pronounced, shaping the course of warfare and diplomacy in Europe during the tumultuous early 16th century. A portion of the troops, in compliance with the neutrality agreement with the French monarch, were redirected towards papal territories. This strategic manoeuvre forced the French army, already weakened by the loss of Swiss mercenaries, to retreat to the river Adda. Despite their efforts to prevent the enemy from crossing at Vaprio, the French were compelled to further retreat to Milan as they found themselves outnumbered. The situation escalated when a revolt by the Milanese population led to the French and Venetian forces fleeing the city, allowing Colonna's army to be warmly welcomed into Milan on November the 20th. This pivotal moment led to the rest of the duchy falling under Colonna's control, culminating in the proclamation of Francesco Sforza, Ludovico il Moro's second son, as Duke, while papal forces recaptured Emilia. The elation over the expulsion of the French was short-lived, following the passing of Pope Leo on December 1st, 1521. The subsequent papal conclave, marked by intense rivalry between cardinals aligned with the imperial and French factions, resulted in the unexpected election of Charles V's former tutor as Adrian VI in January 1522, with the newly appointed pontiff not arriving in Rome until late August. The interim administration by the clergy provided an opportunity for many nobles to reclaim lost territories and assert influence. Della Rovere, for instance, regained control of his duchy and instigated conflict in central Italy the following spring. The shift in power dynamics also led to the release of numerous Swiss mercenaries by Colonna due to dwindling support and resources for the ongoing war efforts. As the French and Venetians regrouped and resumed their offensive in Lombardy, a significant development occurred with the arrival of 16,000 Swiss troops and the skilled cavalry commander Giovanni delle Bande Nere joining their forces. Colonna, recognizing the need for a fortified defence, meticulously organised the protection of Milan, including the besieging of French forces in the castle of Milan and the reinforcement with 4,000 German mercenaries. Despite the Venetian and Swiss reinforcements, Colonna's staunch defence, coupled with support from the Milanese populace, successfully repelled Lautrec and his troops. Meanwhile, Francesco Sforza, accompanied by 6,000 German mercenaries, made strategic moves towards Pavia, leading to a series of intense confrontations and sieges that would shape the ongoing conflict in Lombardy. Nestled just 5 kilometres to the north of Milan, the troops were strategically positioned at the formidable La Bicocca Manor, which was cleverly fortified with ditches and marshes. This defensive setup proved to be impenetrable, effectively thwarting any French cavalry attempts to encircle them. Under Colonna's meticulous command, arquebuses and cannons were strategically placed behind an embankment and a ditch, with Spanish pikes and German Landsknechts under the leadership of von Frundsberg, offering crucial support. Meanwhile, the men-at-arms were kept in reserve to prevent a situation reminiscent of the Ravenna incident, while reinforcements from Milan were on their way to bolster their ranks. As tensions escalated, a skirmish involving light cavalry spurred the Swiss mercenaries to bravely advance, supported by French foot knights under the command of Lescun on the left flank, while the Venetians remained in reserve. The bold Swiss pikes charged forward, only to be met with the systematic and devastating fire of the arquebusiers for the first time. The strategic advance, retreat, and reloading of the arquebusiers caused chaos among the Helvetic battalions, leading to their eventual disintegration under the relentless gunfire. Even those who managed to breach the embankment were met with the fierce resistance of the Landsknecht pikes, sealing their defeat. In a parallel development, the French cavalry encountered some success within the enemy encampment, but faced a strong counter-offensive from the Spanish cavalry, forcing Lescun to retreat across the bridge as the Milanese forces closed in around him. The Swiss mercenaries bore the brunt of the casualties with over 3,000 losses, whereas the Allies suffered minimal losses. Faced with this defeat, Lautrec had no choice but to order a retreat, with the Swiss mercenaries making their way back to their homeland. After opting not to pursue the retreating enemy forces, Colonna shifted his focus to the siege of Genoa, eventually bringing the city under imperial control in August. Emperor Charles and his trusted advisor, Mercorino di Catinara, effectively leveraged their influence to compel Italian states to contribute to the ongoing war efforts. Tensions arose with the arrival of Pope Adrian in Rome in August, sparking disagreements with the imperial envoys over issues such as troop quartering and other contentious matters. The d'Este family, in collaboration with the Pope, were actively engaged in mediating peace negotiations between the warring monarchs, with a primary goal of redirecting their attention towards the threat posed by the Ottoman Turks. Despite these efforts, King Francis of France stood in opposition to the proposed compromise and instead forged an alliance with the Emperor, various Italian states, and Henry of England, who had previously supported the Spanish in their military campaigns. Venice, on the other hand, opted for a separate peace agreement with the Emperor, thereby distancing itself from the French faction. Francis, despite his ambitious plans to lead a formidable army into Italy, faced numerous obstacles, including the looming threat of Spanish incursions, a surprise English raid, and the internal rebellion led by the Duke of Bourbon. The Duke's unsuccessful invasion of Burgundy and subsequent defection to the Emperor's side added further complexity to the unfolding political landscape. Meanwhile, a French military contingent under the command of the Seigneur of Bonnevet traversed the Alps and found themselves embroiled in fierce battles across Lombardy. In November, Giulio de' Medici was coronated as Pope Clement VII, ushering in a new era of papal leadership during the ongoing conflict. Additional reinforcements arrived in Milan during the harsh winter months, bolstering the imperial forces, while the French supply lines faced disruptions, weakening their strategic position in the region. Bonnevet, after exhausting his army and resources, was compelled to retreat in unfavourable conditions, facing mounting pressure from his adversaries. The French suffered a significant setback when they were ambushed while crossing the river Sesia in April 1524, leading to the decisive Battle of Romagnano, where the Spanish cavalry and arquebusiers emerged victorious. Subsequently, the remaining French strongholds in Italy fell one by one, as imperial forces commanded by Charles of Bourbon and the Marquis of Pescara pressed forward, occupying key territories in Provence and capturing major towns. Though Marseille put up a valiant resistance, the city eventually surrendered following a prolonged siege. Upon receiving news of these developments, King Francis, incensed by the attacks on his territory and Bourbon's treachery, swiftly mobilised his forces towards the Po Valley, seizing the opportunity to capitalise on the shifting dynamics of the conflict. During the Battle of Pavia, the French forces led by King Francis I were met with fierce resistance from the defenders of the city. Their initial attempts to breach the walls were unsuccessful, prompting Francis to employ a strategic manoeuvre of diverting a river through his engineers to weaken the city's defences. Unfortunately, heavy winter rains hindered their progress, prolonging the siege. On the other side, the Spanish forces under Antonio de Leyva faced financial hardships, forcing them to resort to desperate measures like looting churches and carrying out assassinations to sustain their campaign. Amidst the intensifying conflict, King Francis saw an opportunity to reclaim the Kingdom of Naples by deploying troops to secure key regions and garnering support from various factions. Conversely, Emperor Emperor Charles's army received reinforcements, strengthening the imperial forces. The involvement of the Venetians was limited as they hesitated to take sides, while the Pope maintained a neutral stance, adding layers of complexity to the already intricate situation. As tensions continued to rise, the Marquis of Pescara took command of the imperial forces and initiated a march towards Pavia. The French army, enduring a harsh winter siege, prepared for the imperial army's advance. Upon the arrival of the imperial forces, King Francis strategically relocated his camp along the vernacular brook to fortify their defences. This led to skirmishes and raids, resulting in casualties on both sides and further escalating the conflict. The Italian wars unfolded with shifting alliances and strategic manoeuvres, with the Battle of Pavia marking a crucial turning point in the power struggle between the French and the Spanish imperial forces. This pivotal battle not only influenced subsequent confrontations, but also shaped the geopolitical landscape of the region, setting the stage for future alliances and conflicts in the Italian wars. Retreating to recover with the majority of his troops, the imperial leaders opted to strike before their own forces disintegrated due to financial constraints, while the French summoned back Grisons mercenaries to protect their native land. The imperial army, consisting of approximately 170,000 foot soldiers from Spain, Italy, and Germany, along with 1,000 mounted soldiers and light cavalry, as well as 17 cannons, prepared to face the French forces of about 1,80,000 infantry from Switzerland, Germany, Italy, and France, 1,300 mounted soldiers, and 53 cannons. Pescara assumed control of the imperial forces and directed them to advance north along the wall, while the camp's artillery continued its bombardment. Overnight, engineers stealthily demolished a section of the wall surrounding the Mirabello Park, creating multiple breaches, catching the French off guard as they believed the enemy was retreating towards Milan. On February 24th, a vanguard of 3,000 arquebusiers, led by the Marquis del Vasto, infiltrated the park, aiming to capture Francis at Castel Mirabello. They launched an attack on the castle and ransacked the camp, causing chaos among the non-combatants before the commanders could restore order. At the same time, French scouts detected the unusual sounds, and Tiercelin led 1,000 light cavalry to disrupt the enemy's preparations. As more imperial soldiers organised themselves, Francis was alerted and instructed his knights to ready themselves for a charge, forming a protective circle around him. The battlefield's obscured visibility and the park's uneven terrain posed challenges for the French in identifying their adversaries. Despite uncertainties, Francis ordered a frontal assault, unleashing a relentless charge against the enemy lines. Whether underestimating the opposing forces or buying time for his infantry to assemble, Francis led the charge with determination and resolve. The imperial cavalry, lacking superior armour, found themselves outmatched by their well-armoured adversaries, resulting in their dispersion on the battlefield. In response to the siege, the garrison strategically fired 3 cannon shots, effectively isolating the French soldiers from their main army. This isolation led to a vulnerable position for the French knights, who fell into an ambush set by Del Vasto's arquebuses, causing significant casualties among their ranks. As the valiant French king continued to fight, his loyal retinue made the ultimate sacrifice to ensure his safety. A brutal and chaotic melee ensued between the German Landsknechts and the Spanish infantry, as well as the Flemish Landsknechts, resulting in a high number of casualties fueled by long-standing animosities. The arrival of reinforcements from the garrison garrison in Pavia disrupted the French infantry formation, compelling Francis and his surviving knights to surrender to the Spanish cavalry. Many French soldiers perished while attempting to flee across the Ticino River, with those who survived falling into the hands of the Duke of Alençon. The French army suffered significant losses, with numerous leaders either killed or captured, leaving a temporary void in French leadership. Francis, now a captive, lamented the loss of everything except his life and honour, coming to terms with the fact that Charles held complete authority over him. After the capture of Francis and the French army's retreat through the Alps, Louise of Savoy, acting as regent, took charge of fortifying the kingdom's defences and initiating negotiations for her son's release. Charles imposed harsh terms, including the surrender of various territories, which Francis found deeply humiliating. Despite his victory, the emperor chose to refrain from further military engagements, sparking concerns among Italian states about his expanding power. The Venetians, alarmed by the emperor's perceived arrogance, sought to unite Italian states against him, advocating for a return to the balanced system of the 14th century and a resurgence of Italian national pride. The imperial envoy's demand for financial contributions only served to stoke resentment and galvanise efforts to form a new alliance aimed at countering the emperor's growing influence and power in the region. Threatened by the Ghibellines and pressured by Charles, the Pope initially resisted, but eventually found a compromise. Duke Francesco Sforza of Milan was hesitant to align with Charles, fearing financial strain. His attempt to conspire against Charles failed, resulting in Spanish control over the castle of Milan. The death of Fernando d'Avalos in December 1525 created a power vacuum in the imperial leadership. Francis, after relinquishing his claims and the Duchy of Burgundy, declined to endorse the treaty due to his sons being held captive by the Spanish. He began diplomatic negotiations with Italy and England. Charles, facing financial constraints, was unable to mount a military response, leading to the establishment of the Holy League of Cognac on May 22nd, 1526, comprising France, the Pope, Venice, Milan, and Florence. The League, supposedly formed to combat the Ottomans and the Protestant Reformation, included a provision recognising the autonomy of Italian states. Clement and Venice preemptively launched an attack on Charles, with Venetian and papal forces advancing towards Milan with 22,000 soldiers. Despite a favourable situation, with the Milanese citizens rebelling against the Imperials, the League inexplicably chose to retreat, allowing the Duke of Bourbon to reinforce the city. They redirected their efforts to Cremona, securing its capture in September after facing setbacks due to the absence of Swiss reinforcements. Francesco Sforza eventually surrendered his castle to the besiegers. Internal strife within the League arose in September, when Pope Clement's attempts to undermine pro-imperial governments were met with an imperial invasion by the Colonna, leading to the sacking of Rome. Besieged in Castel Sant'Angelo, Clement had to agree to a truce and withdraw his troops. In November, an imperial Landsknecht army entered Italy, weakening the League's forces further. Despite Giovanni dalla Bandinera's efforts, the League faced disarray as the rulers of Mantua and Este supported the Germans, facilitating their advance towards Milan. The de' Medici cavalry engaged the Germans in an attempt to hinder their progress. The soldiers of the League found themselves in a precarious situation when they were taken by surprise by the enemy's artillery, resulting in the tragic death of Giovanni, a significant blow to their forces. The events that transpired in Milan in February of 1527 saw an unexpected alliance between the Germans and Imperials, leading to the swift formation of an army comprised comprising over 30,000 soldiers by March. However, the challenges arose as Bourbon struggled to maintain control over his hungry and restless troops, who were determined to march south, despite Clement's willingness to negotiate a new truce. Simultaneously, the League's forces reinforced Florence, successfully quelling a rebellion against the ruling Medici family and compelling the Florentines to forge a new alliance with France and Venice to bolster their defences. The daring advance of Bourbon's rebellious army saw them bypass the heavily fortified Florence and make rapid progress through Latium, culminating in their arrival at the gates of Rome on May 5th. Inside the city, Renzo da Terry Orsini commanded a meagre force of about 3,000 men, while the Imperials had bolstered their ranks with deserters and outlaws. In the early hours of May 6th, under the cover of dense fog, the Imperial troops breached the ancient Leonine walls. Despite the valiant efforts of Renzo da Terry's volunteers to repel the initial assault, the second wave proved too formidable to resist. The death of Charles of Bourbon, struck down by an arquebus while scaling the walls, only served to embolden his troops, who surged into the Vatican and spread throughout the city, sowing chaos and destruction in their wake. Pope Clement, who was in prayer at St. Peter's Basilica, narrowly evaded capture by fleeing to the safety of Castel Sant'Angelo, albeit at the cost of his loyal Swiss guards. Following the Pope's steadfast refusal to engage in negotiations, the mercenaries wrested control of Rome, unleashing a wave of looting and pillaging that persisted for weeks. The city descended into a state of lawlessness, with heinous acts such as rape, torture for material gain, and the desecration of sacred sites becoming commonplace. The ensuing influx of people and the breakdown of essential services, including the sewer system, precipitated a deadly plague that ravaged Rome's population, resulting in a significant decline from 50,000 to 30,000 inhabitants due to a combination of deaths and mass exodus. The sack of Rome reverberated throughout Italy and beyond, casting a dark shadow over Charles's legacy and leaving a lasting impact on the collective psyche of Europeans. Despite the belated arrival of the League's army 15 days later, their leaders ultimately decided to withdraw, deeming the rescue mission for the Pope futile in the face of staunch resistance. Meanwhile, the imperial commanders hesitated to rein in their marauding mercenaries, who continued their unchecked spree of looting and violence. Eventually, Clement relented to the demands of the Imperials, agreeing to a hefty ransom of 400,000 ducats and ceding control of several strategic towns. Venice assumed governance of Ravenna, while a coup in Florence ousted the Medici rulers from power. Although some imperial soldiers succumbed to the plague or absconded with stolen riches, a contingent remained in Rome, awaiting their promised compensation until a semblance of order was restored in the city. Following the successful expulsion of the mercenary forces from the city, King Charles of Spain faced challenges in securing the release of Clement from captivity in Italy. His attempts to exert control over his troops were met with difficulties, as the mercenaries demanded more money and hostages for the Pope's freedom. Eventually, Clement managed to escape, thanks to the efforts made by the Pope to meet the demands of the mercenaries. In the wake of the sack of Rome, a hurried alliance was formed between France and England. By August, King Francis of France funded the deployment of another army under the leadership of the Count of Lautrec into Italy. This move posed a significant threat to the Spanish commander in Milan, de Leyva, who was already struggling to maintain discipline among his soldiers and repel attacks. The French forces seeking revenge for the resistance they faced in 1525, captured Genoa, Alessandria, and looted Pavia before turning their attention to the imperial supply base in Naples. As the conflict in Naples unfolded, with the French forces advancing and the imperial army led by Orange laying siege, a series of setbacks plagued the French, including a shortage of supplies, disease outbreaks, and defections to the imperial side. The death of Lautrec from the plague in August led to a general retreat of surviving soldiers, although resistance pockets in Abruzzo and Venetian-held cities in Apulia continued to hold out. Meanwhile, Taleva pressed on with his military campaign around Milan, facing off against French incursions in Piedmont and the loss of Genoa to Andrea Doria, who disrupted French communication routes. Despite Francis's efforts to reclaim Genoa, illness and financial constraints hindered the French army, resulting in Genoa regaining its independence. The ongoing skirmishes along the Genoese border and raids in Lombardy culminated in the French defeat at Landriano. European monarchs, recognizing the need to end the conflict, engaged in discussions that led to the signing of the Peace of Cambrai on August 5th. This treaty, mirroring the terms of the Peace of Madrid, saw Charles renouncing his claims on Burgundy and allowing for the ransom of French princes, while the Peace of Barcelona with the Pope marked a significant development in the conflicts. The exclusion of other states from the negotiations left Francis's allies in Italy vulnerable to the emperor's decisions. Charles V, in a bid to restore peace and stability in Italy, engaged in intricate negotiations that saw the return of territories to various factions. His agreement to return Ravenna, Servia, Modena, and Reggio, and reinstate the Sforza in Milan and the de' Medici in Florence as dukes marked a significant shift in power dynamics in the region. The concessions made by the Pope, including confirming the investiture of the Kingdom of Naples and granting tax concessions, underscored the complexity of the diplomatic manoeuvring at play. Despite initial conflicts with Venice and Francesco Sforza, Charles V's arrival in Genoa with a formidable army signalled his determination to resolve the disputes. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding Charles V's coronation as King of Italy and subsequent imperial coronation in Bologna were not merely symbolic, but aimed at solidifying his authority across Europe. His interactions with various Italian states, such as conferring ducal status on the Gonzagas in Mantua and confirming the Este's ownership of Modena and Reggio, demonstrated his commitment to establishing alliances and maintaining order in the region. The emperor's engagement in addressing the Protestant uprising in Germany highlighted the multifaceted challenges he faced in maintaining control over his vast empire. The conflict in Florence, fueled by the Florentine Republican government's persecution of Medici supporters, showcased the intricate political landscape of the time. The strategic maneuvers of the Florentine forces, led by figures like Francesco Ferrucci, against the imperial siege, highlighted the resilience of the city-state in the face of overwhelming odds. The shifting tides of battle in the Tuscan countryside, with skirmishes for resources and attrition, underscored the brutal realities of warfare during this period. Ultimately, the Battle of Cabanana proved decisive, with the imperial forces emerging victorious, signalling a significant turning point in the power struggles within Italy. The valiant resistance of the Florentines against the Spanish forces was ultimately overcome, leading to their defeat in the battle. The Prince of Orange's death from an arquebus shot during the conflict was a significant loss for the Imperials. Despite their victory, the Imperials opted to engage in negotiations with the Florentine commander to avoid a repeat of the devastating sack of Rome. The commander, looking out for the interests of Perugia, eventually surrendered Florence to the emperor on August 12th, 1530. Following a year under transitional governance, Alessandro de' Medici was declared the Duke of the Republic upon his arrival in Florence in the summer of 1531, consolidating power and marking the end of the era of Italian comuni and republics. After stabilising the situation in Italy, Charles there turned his attention to other pressing challenges. He journeyed to Germany to address the Protestant Reformation among the imperial princes united in the Schmalkaldic League. Although progress was limited, the Ottoman Turks posed a significant threat to his empire, having expanded into Hungary and besieged Vienna in 1529, alongside the aggressive Barbary corsairs in the Mediterranean. Charles personally led the successful expedition to conquer Tunis in 1535, a high point of his reign. Despite setbacks, Francis I persistently sought to regain his lost territories, forming alliances with German Lutherans and the Ottoman Sultan to challenge Charles' rule in Hungary and the Mediterranean islands. In Italy, Francis strengthened diplomatic ties with Venice, excluded from the Emperor's League, and Pope Clemens, who was dissatisfied with Charles' failure to return Parma and Modena. An alliance was solidified in October 1533 when Francis's son Henry d'Orléans married Caterina de' Medici, a 12-year-old niece of the Pope. This strategic union aimed to secure the Medici family's position in Florence and provide Francis with an alternative route should his relations with Charles deteriorate. With the passing of Clement in September 1534, Pope Paul III ascended to the papal throne. On the night of November 1st, 1535, the Duke of Milan, Francesco Sforza, passed away, paving the way for a transition in leadership as de Leyva assumed control of the duchy's main centres. Following the unexpected death of a noble within the empire, the emperor found himself faced with a weighty decision regarding the disposition of the deceased's titles. The duchy in question posed a dilemma for Charles, as it held significant economic and strategic value, yet bestowing it upon an Italian prince could potentially foster peace within the region. In a bid to carefully navigate this delicate situation, Charles chose to temporarily retain control of the territory while seeking input from other Italian states and France. However, tensions escalated when the French monarch, viewing Charles' territorial ambitions with suspicion, mobilised forces to seize the Duchy of Savoy, which stood at a crossroads due to its geographical location split by the Alps. The reigning Duke, Charles the Good, who shared familial ties with the French king, had formed an alliance with the emperor through a marriage alliance, further complicating the political landscape. As the conflict unfolded during the winter of 1536, the French capitalised on a dispute between Calvinist Geneva and Savoy, deploying their army to take control of the French portion of the duchy and subsequently capturing the city of Turin in Piedmont by March. Claiming inheritance through his mother, Louise of Savoy, Francis staked his claim to various territories in the region, including Nice, Asti, and Vercelli. Meanwhile, Charles, who was in Naples at the time, was informed of these developments and the passing of Francesco Sforza. In response, he mustered an army and embarked for Rome, where he received a warm reception from the newly appointed Pope Paul III, who opted for neutrality in the conflict, showcasing his diplomatic finesse on the international stage. Concurrently, de Leyva rallied reinforcements and initiated efforts to recapture the occupied towns in Piedmont. Upon his arrival in Piedmont, Charles made the strategic decision to launch a counter-offensive into Provence. separate Spanish imperial army advanced into Picardy. The French, resorting to scorched earth tactics in Provence, aimed to thwart Charles's advances, while an outbreak of disease further weakened the imperial troops. Unable to secure Marseille and facing dwindling resources, Charles was compelled to abandon the campaign and retreat towards the Low Countries. As French supporters bolstered their presence in Turin, Charles entrusted Marquis del Vasto with command in Italy before departing for Spain. However, political intrigue continued to unfold in Italy as the assassination of Alessandro de' Medici led to the rise of the teenage Cosimo de' Medici without the emperor's confirmation. Francis seized upon this opportunity to undermine one of Charles's allies, but his efforts were met with resistance at Montemurlo by forces loyal to the Medici, underscoring the complex web of alliances and rivalries shaping the Italian political landscape. Concerned about the growing influence of Cosimo and the potential alliance between him and Francis, Charles took action by elevating Cosimo to the esteemed position of Duke. The conflict in Piedmont reached a critical juncture in 1537, with the arrival of French reinforcements in March, bolstering the garrisons and launching an offensive. Despite initial setbacks due to funding shortages and lack of discipline, Del Vasto managed to counterattack and confine the French troops to key locations. Francis himself entered Piedmont later that year, gaining control of significant territories until a truce was established in November, mediated by the Pope in Nice in June 1538. The pursuit of a lasting peace continued through marriage negotiations as Charles travelled through France to the Netherlands, but a resolution remained elusive. Charles's North African campaign in the autumn aimed to conquer Algiers, but faced challenges from adverse weather and strong resistance, resulting in a significant defeat. Struggling with financial and military obstacles, Charles found himself in a precarious position, leading Francis to declare war in June 1542, following the murder of a French envoy in Milan. The Seventh Italian War marked a departure from previous conflicts, evolving into a broader European power struggle between the Habsburgs and the Valois dynasties. French forces launched assaults on various fronts, including attempts in Roussillon and the Netherlands, met with varying degrees of success. The Duke of Cleves and Jollick's alliance with France further complicated the situation, leading to skirmishes in Brabant and Flanders. Despite Charles's efforts, the French army thwarted his advances, creating a tense and dynamic battlefield across multiple regions. In Piedmont, the conflict took on a more contained nature as Del Vasto's attempts at offensive manoeuvres reached a stalemate. The summer of 1543 saw the besiegement of Nice by French and Turkish fleets, sparking controversy over the collaboration between Muslim and Christian forces. Charles of Savoy intervened to drive out the invaders, leading to a temporary resolution, but leaving lingering tensions in the region. The intricate web of alliances, military strategies, and shifting power dynamics characterized this period of intense conflict in Europe. After securing additional funds from his sovereign, Del Vasto veered northward to launch an assault on some French strongholds, thereby severing their communication channels. In the spring of 1544, a French army led by François de Bourbon, Count of Enghien, penetrated into Piedmont and laid siege to Carignano, a strategic location previously captured by Del Vasto, posing a hindrance to French communication networks. Del Vasto, in his bid to relieve the town, established his encampment in the village of Serrasoli, merely a few kilometres away from his adversary. On the 14th of April, Bourbon manoeuvred his forces towards the village to confront Del Vasto. Both armies positioned themselves for combat on a plain devoid of any obstacles, situated upon two slight inclines. The precise troop numbers remain uncertain. It appears that the French fielded approximately 13,000 to 15,000 soldiers, including about 1,500 French-Italian cavalry, while the imperial forces numbered either similar or slightly more, with roughly 18,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. Each side also possessed around 20 cannons. The armies were structured into 3 infantry divisions, supported by 3 cavalry units. The battle unfolded with both factions deploying a few hundred arquebusiers and cannons to gain a tactical edge and outmaneuver their foes. Following several hours of skirmishing, Del Vasto dispatched his Florentine light cavalry to eliminate the enemy shooters, only to encounter opposition from the rival cavalry. Simultaneously, Del Vasto ordered a full advance of his units. The momentum of the French cavalry, led by D'Esterme, proved formidable, first routing the Florentines, who retreated into the Italian infantry, and then penetrating deep into the Italian forces themselves. The light cavalry found themselves encircled and eventually surrendered to the French, necessitating a period of reorganisation. Meanwhile, in the centre, Del Vasto's Landsknechts had to divide their forces to engage both the Gascon and Swiss elements of the French army. The Gascons and Germans advanced alongside handgunners in their secondary ranks, inflicting heavy casualties on the front lines upon engagement. As the Germans pressed forward swiftly, their formation began to falter. Initially colliding with the French forces, they were subsequently charged by the Swiss contingent. The fierce combat involving pikes was disrupted when French gendarmes flanked the Landsknechts, striking their flank and forcing them down the hill, while the Spanish men-at-arms were rebuffed by the Swiss following an initial assault. On the left flank, the situation deteriorated for the French. Despite their horse archers routing the Neapolitan light cavalry, the units from Gruyere panicked upon facing the seasoned Spanish and German soldiers, fleeing the battlefield along with the Italian troops. Count d'Enghien and his men-at-arms, accompanied by the remaining French cavalry, then descended the hill, launching an assault on the imperial cavalry. The Battle of Ceresole showcased intricate tactical manoeuvres and decisive engagements that ultimately shifted the balance of power. The clash between Del Vasto and Count d'Enguien's forces highlighted the importance of strategic positioning and the utilisation of diverse military units to gain an advantage on the battlefield. Del Vasto's attempts to relieve Carignano and disrupt French communication lines underscored the significance of controlling key locations in military campaigns. The interaction between infantry, cavalry, and artillery demonstrated the complexity of warfare during this period, with each unit playing a crucial role in determining the outcome of the battle. The fluidity of the fighting, from skirmishes to full-scale engagements, showcased the dynamic nature of Renaissance warfare and the adaptability required by commanders to respond to changing circumstances. The aftermath of the battle marked a significant shift in the power dynamics of the region, with both sides re-evaluating their strategies and military capabilities in the wake of the confrontation at Ceresole. During the Battle of Ceresole, the imperial forces suffered devastating losses, with an estimated 6,000 to 7,000 soldiers killed and 3,000 captured, highlighting the fierce nature of the conflict. In contrast, the French losses were significantly lower, reported to be around 2,000 soldiers, showcasing their tactical advantage in the battle. Despite the setback, Del Vasto's courageous defence of Milan and victory victory over Italian reinforcements at Serravalle demonstrated the resilience of the imperial forces. The surrender of Alba marked the end of the campaign in Piedmont, ultimately leading to a truce as both sides regrouped and strategized their next moves. In May 1544, a joint English and imperial army initiated an ambitious invasion of northern France, encountering various challenges and obstacles along the way. The siege of Saint-Dizier proved to be a testing affair for the imperial forces, while the English laid siege to Boulogne, facing staunch resistance from the French defenders. Despite capturing Saint-Dizier in August, further complications arose, causing delays in their military operations. Subsequently, the Emperor decided to conduct raids in Champagne before concluding operations in September, as King Francis scrambled to manage the aftermath and counter the invaders' advances. The Peace of Crepy, formalised on September 18th, 1544, between Francis and Charles, brought a temporary halt to the conflict, reverting to the peace established in Nice. Negotiations for a marriage alliance between a Habsburg princess and Charles d'Orléans were ongoing, with the dowry being a crucial point of contention involving the Low Countries, or Milan. Charles faced a challenging decision regarding the defence of Milan versus the strategic importance of the Low Countries, highlighting the complexities of political and military strategy at the time. However, with the unexpected passing of the Duke of Orléans the following year, the dynamics shifted, leading Charles to pass the duchy to his son Philip, altering the course of diplomatic negotiations. Despite the peace agreement with Francis, tensions persisted between France and England, leading to continued hostilities. Henry's successful siege of Boulogne in September marked a significant victory, effectively concluding the campaign for that year. In 1545, Francis's unsuccessful invasion attempt of the Isle of Wight and the failed siege of Boulogne further underscored the ongoing rivalry and deadlock between the two powers, as both sides sought to assert their dominance in the region. In June of 1546, a significant agreement was finalised that granted Boulogne to King Henry. This event marked a pivotal moment in history, setting the stage for subsequent power shifts and alliances in Europe. The deaths of both Henry and Francis in 1547 brought Edward VI and Henry II to the forefront of leadership in their respective countries. Henry II, the newly crowned French monarch, wasted no time in turning his attention towards the northern frontier, where he threw his support behind the Scottish resistance against English advances. In a strategic move, he also formed alliances with the Ottoman sultans and provided backing to the German Protestant princes, all while harbouring a deep-seated animosity towards Charles, thus Emperor Charles, following the Italian War of 1542-1546, found himself in the delicate position of maintaining the balance of power in Europe. His primary concerns revolved around countering the growing influence of Suleiman the Magnificent and quelling the unrest among the German Protestants, all while grappling with internal tensions within the Habsburg dynasty over the issue of succession. Delegating his Italian responsibilities to his deputies, Charles began to exhibit a sense of superiority, particularly evident in the governance of Milan under the leadership of the new governor, Ferrante Gonzaga. Gonzaga, a staunch advocate for Italo-Spanish interests, soon found himself embroiled in conflicts with the imperial Burgundian faction and Pope Paul's familial ambitions. His orchestrations in 1547 led to the successful elimination of Pierluigi Farnese and the subsequent seizure of Piacenza by the Imperials. However, challenges arose as Pierluigi's heir, Ottavio Farnese, staunchly resisted relinquishing control of Parma. Gonzaga's ambitions extended beyond Piacenza as he sought to expand imperial influence in Genoa and Siena, two cities caught in a complex web of political intrigue involving the Papal State, the Florentines, and the Medici family. The imperial envoys in Siena further exacerbated tensions by inciting revolts and pushing for greater control over coastal strongholds, even going so far as to erect a citadel within the city walls. During the turbulent period of the 1540s in Emilia, the political landscape was complex and multifaceted. The disputes over territories like Piacenza and Parma involved strategic manoeuvres and shifting alliances. After Pope Paul's advice to Charles regarding Piacenza, the involvement of Henry of France added another layer of complication. Even after Julius III affirmed Ottavio's control over Parma, the Farnese family continued to seek support from France. This intricate web of diplomatic interactions eventually led to the eruption of the War of Parma in 1551, with clashes and sieges creating a stalemate that was only broken when additional French forces entered the fray. As the conflict unfolded, the financial strains of prolonged warfare became evident, prompting the involved parties to seek a truce. The agreements reached in 1552 involved complex negotiations between Henry, Ottavio, and Charles, signalling a temporary halt to the hostilities. However, tensions persisted in other regions such as Piedmont, where Gonzaga's incursion into Saluzzo kept the conflict simmering. The shifting alliances and military manoeuvres underscored the volatile nature of power dynamics in Europe during this period. Amidst these regional conflicts, larger geopolitical shifts were also underway. The Ottoman capture of Tripoli in 1551 marked a significant development in the Mediterranean, impacting the balance of power in the region. Meanwhile, Henry's alliance with Protestant rulers and subsequent military campaigns against the empire added another layer of complexity to the European political landscape. Charles's challenges in the face of French incursions and his eventual retreat from Innsbruck highlighted the growing influence of his adversaries. Ultimately, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, brokered by Charles's brother Ferdinand, brought a temporary respite to the religious conflicts that had engulfed the region. The agreement granted religious freedom to Lutheran princes, paving the way for a more stable political environment. Charles's ability to amass a formidable army following the peace accord signified a shift in the power dynamics of Europe, setting the stage for further developments in the tumultuous era of the mid-16th century. In the autumn of 1552, Charles, the powerful ruler, launched a siege on the city of Metz, a stronghold defended by the courageous Duke of Guise. Despite the Duke's valiant efforts to protect the city, a combination of illness and desertions within the defending forces eventually weakened their defences. This prompted Charles to ultimately abandon the siege in January. During the same period, military campaigns unfolded along the northern borders of France in 1553, showcasing the strategic prowess of the young Duke of Savoy, Emmanuel Filiberto. The year 1554 marked a significant moment as Charles had personally participated in combat for the final time at the Battle of Renty. This battle not only signified his declining mental health, but also marked the gradual transfer of power to his son, Philip. Additionally, this period saw his brother Ferdinand rise to the position of Holy Roman Emperor, further reshaping the political landscape of the time. In Italy, the imperial envoy Mendoza's actions in coercing the residents of Siena to construct a fortress triggered a rebellion in July 1552. This uprising gained widespread support from various factions and social classes within the city, leading to the successful ousting of the Spanish occupying forces. The aftermath of the rebellion prompted reactions from multiple factions, including the Vatican and the influential de' Medici family. Eventually, a resolution was reached to dismantle the fortification and expel the garrison. However, the Spanish authorities contemplated a punitive expedition to Tuscany in response to the insurrection. Despite their plans, various obstacles arose, such as the failure to capture Montalcino and the need to defend against incursions from Ottoman forces. The combined French and Ottoman naval fleets, under the leadership of Dragut, further complicated the situation by disrupting Spanish supply routes along the Italian coastline. The year 1553 saw French forces being transported to Corsica, while the Ottomans ravaged Elba and executed the defenders of Bonifacio. The collaboration between the French and Ottomans deteriorated, leading to skirmishes and subsequent retaliation by the Genoese, who managed to seize control of a significant portion of Corsica in the following year. By 1555, a fresh Turkish armada supported the French in unsuccessful siege attempts, prolonging the conflicts until the conclusion of the war. Throughout these turbulent events, Cosimo de' Medici emerged as a key figure in navigating the complex political and military dynamics unfolding in the region. In a bold move, a prominent figure within the imperial faction took matters into his own hands and decided to take decisive action. Despite exhausting all diplomatic avenues to no avail, he chose to mobilize an army and strategically positioned himself as a loyal vassal defending the honour of the empire. This cunning strategy won the approval of Charles, allowing him to temporarily secure the conquered territory. Meanwhile, the Sienese, led by the exiled Florentine Piero Strozzi, found themselves up against a formidable adversary dispatched by Henry to challenge the de' Medici's dominance in Florence. The Marquis of Marignano, Gian Giacomo Medici, led the forces of Cosimo, strategically setting up camp north of Siena to lay siege to the city using ruthless tactics. Strozzi, in an effort to ease the pressure of the siege and spark unrest in Florence, launched a counterattack, first targeting Val di Nievole and then Val di Chiana, where his attempt to capture Arezzo fell short. Pursued by Gian Giacomo Medici, the joint French-Sienese forces encountered a decisive battle at Marciano della Chiana, resulting in the decimation of Siena's army and shattering their hopes of liberation. Despite enduring a prolonged siege, Siena eventually surrendered to Cosimo in April 1555, with French troops and 700 citizens seeking sanctuary in Montalcino under the guise of the Republic of Siena in Montalcino. Seeking allies in Italy, Philip granted Cosimo control over Siena. Meanwhile, Henry focused on Piedmont, where the French, under the leadership of Brissac, secured significant victories. After Gonzaga's retreat in the summer of 1552, the French recaptured lost territories and posed a threat to Liguria by the spring of 1553. Vercelli, the administrative centre of the remaining Duchy of Savoy, briefly fell under French occupation and raids that autumn. Despite Gonzaga's recall to Brussels in 1554, his inexperienced successor succumbed to Brissac's swift conquests of Ivrea and Casale. Even the arrival of the Duke of Alba, a formidable commander of the empire, could not reverse the tide in Lombardy due to financial constraints. By early 1556, France had consolidated control over most of Piedmont. In Rome, the passing of Pope Julius in March of 1555 marked the ascent of Pope Paul IV, a Neapolitan who aimed to remove Spanish influence from Italy. Forming an alliance with the French king, he extended Milan and Naples as offerings. The groundwork for a French invasion of Italy was laid by the king's favoured Francis Duke of Guise, who orchestrated a league with the Pope and the Duke of Ferrara. Despite opposition from the Constable of France, Montmorency, who was against an Italian campaign, Henry agreed to a truce with Philip in Vaucelles in February 1556. Displeased with the truce, Pope Paul provoked the Spanish by instigating conflicts along their borders. The supporters of the Colonna family found themselves at the receiving end of aggressive actions, leading to the loss of their properties to the Pope's relatives. This situation escalated in September 1556, when the Duke of Alba initiated a strategic move by launching a preemptive strike on the Papal State. The Duke's forces swiftly progressed towards Rome, laying siege to the city and eventually agreeing to a truce. However, hopes for a lasting peace between the Pope and Philip were dashed as the anticipated pact failed to materialise. Consequently, the Duke of Guise was summoned in January 1557 to come to the aid of the Pope, leading to the deployment of French troops in Naples. Despite facing challenges in Naples, a moderate peace agreement was eventually brokered between Spain and the Pope, though localised skirmishes continued in Italy until 1558. The campaign in Naples led by Guise encountered setbacks, as the French had to divert attention to pressing matters on the northern front, where King Philip was assembling a formidable army under the leadership of Duke Emanuele Filiberto. Adding to the complexity, the English joined forces in support of Spain. By June, the Spanish forces initiated the siege of the St. Quentin fortress, defended by Constable Montmorency and a smaller French contingent. The pivotal Battle of St. Quentin unfolded on August 2nd, with Admiral Gaspard de Coligny successfully breaching the encirclement and gaining entry into the town. Nestled on the northern banks of the River Somme, the city of St. Quentin was strategically positioned amidst marshlands, proving to be a significant obstacle for the advancing Spanish troops. The challenging terrain added to the complexities of the conflict, setting the stage for a protracted and intense struggle for control of the region. Savoy's strategic positioning of his troops along the key access points to the city resulted in a significant advantage for the Spanish forces. By effortlessly capturing the southern outskirts and blockading the bridge over the Somme, communication between the defenders and the main army was effectively disrupted. Montmorency's attempt to reinforce the garrison from La Fère the following night was thwarted when the captured knights revealed the plan, leading to a barrage of arquebus fire meeting the reinforcements under St. Andre. In a bold and daring move on the night of August 9th, Montmorency ordered an advance to exploit a clear stretch of river to the west for ferrying troops beneath the city walls. The infantry, with their large boats, reached the designated spot by the morning of the 10th, while the cavalry engaged the entrenched Spanish unit in the Faubourg de Lille suburb to the city's south. Despite the presence of a small ford at Rouvroy to the north of St. Quentin, which Montmorency had underestimated, only a squadron of German raiders was dispatched there. As the French troops slowly embarked on their boats, field pieces fired towards the enemy camp across the river, but progress was impeded by the muddy banks and marshy terrain, leading to delays. After several hours, only 450 men managed to enter the city, with others facing obstacles such as drowning, getting stuck, or losing their way. Savoy quickly reacted by directing his cavalry to gather to the east of the city and cross the ford at Rouvroy, dispersing the raiders before the anticipated reinforcement from the French cavalry could arrive. Upon learning of the situation, Montmorency decided to halt the transport operation, ordering the infantry to retreat while the cavalry provided cover. Observing the Spanish cavalry assembling to encircle the French forces, Montmorency ordered a retreat. South of the river, his outnumbered troops encountered Dutch and German light cavalry, leading to a confrontation where Montmorency was captured after a final charge, while others dispersed and were pursued. Following the cavalry's actions, the Spanish forces targeted the infantry columns, attacking from the flanks. The foot soldiers, facing relentless harassment from the Spanish reiters, fragmented into smaller pike units and ultimately crumbled in the face of cannon fire. Despite attempts by some French soldiers to flee, many were either captured or killed in the ensuing battle. The French army, during the battle, suffered significant losses, ranging between 12,000 to 18,000 casualties, with half of them being taken as prisoners of war. In contrast, the Spanish forces emerged relatively unscathed. Despite the victory, the Duke of Savoy was eager to lead the troops to Paris, but the king ordered the siege to continue. Gaspard de Coligny valiantly defended the town, holding out for an additional 2 weeks until it finally fell on August 27th after a fierce bombardment. Coligny was captured during the assault, but his determined resistance significantly delayed the campaign's progress. Surprisingly, Philip ordered his army to retreat in September, abandoning the advance towards Paris. Upon his return from Naples, the Duke of Guise orchestrated raids in the northern region of Champagne during the autumn to divert the attention of the Spanish forces from their actual target. In the ensuing winter, he launched an offensive into the Netherlands. In January, he successfully seized Calais from the English after a brief siege, marking the reconquest of the final English territory on the continent. Subsequently, in June, he captured Thionville from the Spanish. However, the French resurgence faced a setback at Gravelines, where a French contingent under Determe was decimated by the Spanish army during a raiding operation in the Netherlands. A substantial imperial army arrived in July from the north and faced the French army along the River Somme, but both sides refrained from direct conflict due to exhaustion. This led to a truce being agreed upon and signed in October 1558. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis was ratified on April 3rd, 1559, ushering in an era of peace. The treaty stipulated that Henry relinquish all territorial holdings and claims in Italy except for Saluzzo and withdraw his troops from Italy and Luxembourg. Emmanuel Filiberto of Savoy was reinstated as the ruler of his duchy, along with all his territories, on the condition of marrying Henry's sister and leaving certain fortresses under French control. In exchange, the French monarchy was allowed to keep Calais and the 3 bishoprics. Absent from the treaty were provisions concerning the exiles from Naples, Milan, and Florence residing in the French court, who were prohibited from returning to their homelands. With the conclusion of the Italian wars, which had spanned nearly 65 years of continuous conflicts on the Italian peninsula, the political landscape of the region underwent a significant transformation. Shortly after, King Henry met his demise in a fatal tournament accident during the summer, plunging France into a brutal religious civil war, while Philip faced the challenging task of maintaining unity within his realm. And that, dear listeners, brings us to the end of our serene exploration of the Italian wars, from the initial invasions to the shifting alliances and ultimate resolutions. We've traversed a period rich in drama and historical significance. I hope you found this journey as intriguing as I did. Thank you for joining me on the ASMR History channel. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe for more whispered tales of the past. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what other historical events or periods you want us to whisper about next. Until next time, may your nights be filled with the peaceful echoes of history. Sweet dreams, and goodbye.